Chapter 1. The Gilded Realm. The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones as Prince Allarian approached the gates of Tor Halen, the capital of his family's kingdom. The spires of the castle pierced the gray winter sky like jagged daggers, their gold-plated tips catching the pale sunlight. The sight should have filled him with pride, but unease churned in his chest. It had been 3 years since he had left this place, a gilded sanctuary surrounded by a sea of emerald forests and rolling hills, to study in the grand universities of Altdorf. Back then, his father, King Edric, had been a towering figure of strength and wisdom, beloved by the people and respected even beyond their borders. Now, his father was dead. A sudden chill swept through the air as the carriage passed beneath the portcullis. The courtyard was eerily quiet. The usual throngs of bustling attendants and guards were absent, replaced by small clusters of soldiers in muted armor, speaking in hushed tones. Their gazes lingered on Allarian for a moment too long, as though they were sizing him up. The doors of the castle opened with a groan, revealing his mother, Queen Isolde, standing at the top of the grand staircase. Her once vivid auburn hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes bore the weight of sleepless nights. She descended slowly, her steps measured, her face composed, yet distant. "Allarian," she greeted, her voice formal and cold. "It is good to see you." "And you, mother," Allarian replied, stepping forward to kiss her hand. She flinched almost imperceptibly, but he noticed. Before he could ask about her unease, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the hall. "Welcome home, nephew." Allarian turned to see his uncle, Halthar, striding into the hall. Once a trusted advisor to King Edric, Halthar now wore the crown that should have rested on Allarian's own brow. His broad shoulders carried a regal cloak lined with sable fur, and his sharp blue eyes glimmered with a mix of warmth and calculation. "I regret that your return must be under such grim circumstances," Halthar continued, placing a hand on Allarian's shoulder. "Your father was a great man. We all feel his loss keenly." "Ah." Allarian nodded, but said nothing. Something about Halthar's touch made his skin crawl. That evening, a feast was held in the grand hall to welcome the prince. The hall was adorned with banners bearing the royal crest, and tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, spiced wines, and gilded platters of fruits. Yet the atmosphere was subdued, the laughter forced, the music half-hearted. Seated at the head of the table, Allarian observed the gathered nobles. Their faces were familiar, but their expressions were veiled, their conversations laden with innuendo. He caught snatches of whispers as goblets clinked and plates were passed. "A tragedy, truly, but so sudden. 3 weeks ill, they say, though some whispered darker causes. The prince, does he suspect? Surely not." "William." As the night wore on, Allarian's unease deepened. He excused himself from the table and wandered the halls of the castle, hoping to find solace in solitude. Instead, he found memories. Of his father's laughter, of late nights spent listening to tales of honor and sacrifice, of a world that now seemed distant and false. He paused before a familiar door. His father's study. The room had been left untouched, its heavy oak door ajar. Stepping inside, Allarian inhaled the scent of aged parchment and pipe smoke. The desk was cluttered with documents, maps, and an unfinished letter. One parchment in particular caught his eye. It bore the royal seal, but was partially burned, as though someone had tried to destroy it. The remaining text was cryptic. "Beware the shifting tides, trust no." The rest was illegible. As Allarian pondered the message, a shadow passed by the open door. He turned quickly, but the hall was empty. The whispers in the castle were no longer just gossip. They were warnings, faint echoes of a conspiracy lurking beneath the surface. Allarian clenched the parchment tightly in his fist. Karina slid the parchment tightly in his fist. His father's death was no mere accident. and he would find the truth. Chapter 2. The Veiled Mirror. The air in the castle felt heavier the next morning. Even the sunlight that streamed through the grand stained glass windows seemed muted, as if dulled by the weight of unspoken truths. Allarian's steps echoed in the empty corridors as he made his way to the royal vault, summoned there by a servant bearing his uncle's message. When he arrived, the heavy stone doors of the vault stood ajar, and inside he found his uncle Halthar waiting, his hands clasped behind his back. "Ah, there you are, nephew," Halthar greeted, his voice calm but carrying a faint note of mockery. "There is something your father left for you." Allarian frowned. "Why now? Why not when I first returned?" Halthar's smile was thin. "Your father insisted it be given to you when you were ready. I believe now is that time." Gesturing to a large covered object propped against the wall, Halthar stepped aside. The item was swathed in a dusty velvet cloth. Two attendants stepped forward, lifting the covering with careful precision to reveal what lay beneath. A portrait. The sight of it took Allarian aback. The painting was a remarkable likeness of himself, though the artist had taken liberties emphasizing his noble features and bestowing a subtle, almost otherworldly glow upon his image. The prince's emerald eyes in the painting seemed brighter, his posture more regal, his expression more confident than he ever felt in reality. "It was commissioned by your father," Halthar explained. "Painted by Altharus the Arcane, one of the last living practitioners of the old lore. A rare gift, and a fitting legacy." "What?" Allarian stepped closer. The craftsmanship was impeccable, almost unnervingly so. The painted figure seemed to look directly at him, its gaze unflinching, as if alive. "It is impressive," Allarian said, though unease prickled at the back of his mind. "Why would father choose such an unusual artist?" Halthar chuckled, though the sound lacked warmth. "Your father admired the extraordinary. As do I. Keep it well, nephew. It may remind you of the greatness that awaits you." That night the portrait was delivered to Allarian's chambers. He ordered his servants to hang it on the wall above the ornate fireplace, where it would preside over the room like a silent observer. Once alone, he studied the painting again, drawn to its uncanny realism. The moon was full that night, and its silvery light streamed through the arched window, casting the chamber in an ethereal glow. As Allarian paced the room, his attention returned to the painting. Under the moonlight it seemed different. The colors had deepened, the shadows lengthened. The noble visage now appeared darker, its eyes piercing and accusatory. The act was lifted, and the artist set to work, his eyes piercing and accusatory. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. For a fleeting moment, the painted reflection smirked. Allarian stepped back, blinking. The expression was gone, replaced by the original, serene face. A trick of the light, surely. Yet his heart raced, and the room felt colder than before. The following morning, Allarian summoned one of the castle's stewards. "Who delivered the painting to the vault?" he asked, his tone sharp. The steward hesitated. "The artist himself, my lord, many months ago. Altharus is said to have disappeared shortly after." "Disappeared?" Allarian's unease deepened. "Explain." The steward bowed his head. "No one has seen him since your father's passing. Some say he returned to the northern mountains. Others claim darker fates befell him." Allarian dismissed the steward, but could not shake the ominous feeling. He returned to his chambers and stared at the portrait, his thoughts a tumult of curiosity and dread. The longer he gazed at it, the more he felt as though the painting were watching him in return. As the hours passed, the faint memory of his father's voice echoed in his mind, mingling with a deepening suspicion this was no ordinary inheritance. And it was no ordinary portrait. Chapter 3. Festering Doubts. The grand dining hall of Tor Halen was alive with opulence and revelry that evening. Chandeliers of purest crystal bathed the hall in golden light, their warm glow reflecting off the polished marble floors and gilded arches. Tables groaned under the weight of succulent meats, exotic fruits, and spiced wines poured into goblets adorned with intricate runes. Yet amidst the clamor of laughter and music, a tension lingered, palpable to those perceptive enough to sense it. Prince Allarian sat at the head table beside his uncle, King Helthar. The air between them was cordial but cold, each exchange of words a dance of veiled meanings. Allarian forced himself to smile as nobles toasted to the kingdom's prosperity and Helthar's steady rule. But behind their cheerful faces he caught fleeting glances and whispers, threads of suspicion woven into the evening's tapestry. The court mage, an enigmatic figure known as Galvaris, stood at the far end of the hall. Dressed in dark robes embroidered with shimmering patterns, his face was obscured by a hood, though his piercing eyes seemed to glow faintly in the firelight. Galvaris had arrived at court only recently, ostensibly as an envoy from a distant land, offering arcane wisdom to aid the kingdom. His presence unsettled Allarian, though the prince could not say why. As the feast progressed, Galvaris stepped forward, raising his hands for silence. The hall grew quiet, save for the crackling of the great hearth at the room's center. Tom and Claire waited in terror as the audience found their voices, speaking in unison. "Your Majesty," Galvaris began, his voice smooth yet resonant, "and esteemed lords and ladies of Tor Halen, I offer a gift this evening, one of prophecy. The threads of fate are ever shifting, but even the winds of destiny may grant us glimpses of what lies ahead." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Allarian narrowed his eyes. Prophecy. In the realm of chaos, such words were seldom harmless. Galvaris extended his hands toward the hearth, and the flame surged unnaturally, shifting hues from gold to blue to a deep, malevolent violet. The mage's voice dropped to a low chant, the language unfamiliar and guttural, its cadence like the turning of some ancient, unseeing wheel. The flames coalesced into strange shapes, figures shrouded in mist, their forms indistinct yet suggestive. A crowned figure appeared, its silhouette regal but shadowed by the sharp talons of an unseen predator. Beside it another figure emerged, cloaked in flowing robes, its face obscured. "A throne teeters on the edge of ruin," Galvaris intoned. "A kingdom built on gold may shatter beneath the weight of its own deceit. Blood binds and blood betrays, for within the sacred line lies the seed of chaos." The words sent a shiver down Allarian's spine. He glanced at Helthar, whose face remained impassive, though his fingers tightened around the stem of his goblet. "A false king may wear the crown," Galvaris continued, his voice growing darker. "But the shadows know the truth. Beware the feathered serpent that whispers in your ear, for its words bring only ruin." The violet flames collapsed suddenly into embers, leaving the hall in stunned silence. Then, as if on cue, the musicians resumed their melody, and the crowd broke into murmured conversation. Allarian could not suppress the gnawing unease that gripped him. Rising from his seat, he slipped away from the head table and into the shadows at the edge of the hall. He lingered near the mage, whose piercing gaze met his as though he had expected the prince's approach. "What did you mean by blood binds and blood betrays?" Allarian demanded in a low voice. Galvaris's lips curled into a faint smile. "Ah, my prince, the threads of fate weave many truths. Some are clearer than others." "Speak plainly," Allarian pressed, his tone sharper. The mage's expression turned grave. "The prophecy reveals only glimpses, my lord, but know this: the path before you is fraught with deception. Trust not those closest to you, for the serpent's coil may be hidden in the guise of family." Before Allarian could respond, Galvaris bowed and stepped away, leaving the prince with more questions than answers. As the festivities continued, Allarian retreated to a quiet corner of the hall, his mind churning. If Galvaris's words held truth, then the serpent could only mean one thing: betrayal lay within his bloodline. And for the second time, as the night wore on, Allarian's gaze fell upon his uncle, who laughed and drank with the nobles, his manner effortlessly commanding. But beneath that polished exterior, Allarian saw something else, a faint glimmer of calculation, a predator cloaked in regal finery. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and they would fester in Allarian's heart. Chapter 4. Father's Ghost. The castle was quiet, the corridors cloaked in darkness as Allarian made his way back to his chambers. The feast's revelry had long since faded, and only the distant echoes of patrolling guards disturbed the silence. Yet Allarian felt far from alone. The cryptic prophecy weighed heavily on his mind, each word twisting and turning in his thoughts like a knife. He pushed open the door to his chambers, the hinges creaking faintly. The room was dimly lit by the embers of the dying fire in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The portrait above the mantel seemed to watch him as he entered, its painted gaze sharper and more unnerving in the dim light. Allarian froze. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then a voice, soft, echoing, and achingly familiar, broke the stillness. "Arya." The prince turned sharply, his hand instinctively going to the dagger at his belt, but no living figure stood before him. Instead, the air seemed to shimmer, and slowly, a ghostly form materialized in the center of the room. It was his father. King Edric's spectral figure was pale and translucent, his once strong frame now insubstantial and wreathed in a faint blue glow. His eyes, though hollow and shadowed, held the same piercing intensity Allarian remembered so well. "Father?" Allarian's voice trembled, a mix of shock, grief, and disbelief. The apparition nodded, its movement slow and deliberate. "My son, I have come to warn you." Allarian stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Warn me? What is this? How are you here?" "The veil is thin tonight," Edric said, his voice echoing faintly, as though carried on a distant wind. "I have crossed it because I could not rest. My death was no accident." The prince's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? They said it was an illness. A fever." "A lie," the ghost said bitterly. "I was poisoned by those who sought to usurp my throne. They are agents of chaos, serving the will of the Changer of Ways. Even now they plot to bring ruin to our kingdom." Allarian's mind raced, the implications of his father's words unraveling like threads in a frayed tapestry. Who did this? Who betrayed you?" "The crown is large," Ravelia said. Edric's ghost faltered, his form flickering. "The serpent hides in plain sight. Blood binds and blood betrays. Trust no one, my son, not even those you hold dearest." Allarian's chest tightened. His father's warning echoed the cryptic words of the court mage at the feast. The serpent. Betrayal within his own bloodline. "Uncle Halthar," Allarian whispered, the realization settling like a stone in his gut. "I cannot say for certain," the ghost admitted, his form growing fainter. "But the conspiracy runs deep, and Chaos's hand moves unseen. Seek the truth, Allarian. Follow the signs, but tread carefully. The path ahead is perilous." "Father, wait!" Allarian stepped forward, desperate to hold on to the moment. "There's so much more I need to ask. How do I stop this? What must I do?" Edric's form flickered again, his voice fading. "Beware the portrait, my son. It is more than it seems. It watches and it knows." With those final, cryptic words, the ghost vanished, leaving Allarian alone in the cold, dark room. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where his father had been. His heart raced, and his mind swirled with questions. The portrait. His uncle. Chaos. The whispers in the castle were no longer just suspicions. They were truths hidden behind layers of lies, and Allarian knew that to uncover them, he would need to walk a dangerous path, one where every shadow might conceal a dagger, and every ally might be a traitor. He turned to the portrait, its painted eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light. For the first time, he felt certain, it was not merely an heirloom, it was something more, something alive. And it was watching him. Chapter 5. An Oath of Vengeance. The room was still, yet Allarian felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him. His father's ghost had vanished, leaving behind more questions than answers. The air still hummed faintly, charged with the remnants of otherworldly energy, but silence reigned. Allarian's gaze was drawn once more to the portrait above the hearth, its presence now more sinister than ever. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. The painted image seemed subtly changed, its eyes sharper, its expression darker. The faint glow of the firelight caught the oils of the painting, making the shadows deeper, more alive. The face that stared back at him was his, yet it felt alien. Then, something extraordinary happened. A faint shimmer rippled across the surface of the painting, distorting the image. Allarian's breath caught in his throat as the portrait's features began to shift. For a fleeting moment the face of his father appeared in the painting, ghostly and sorrowful, his spectral eyes filled with pain. The silence stretched a moment longer, and "Father," Allarian whispered, stepping closer. The image of King Edric seemed to reach toward him, but before Allarian could react, it was pulled into the depths of the canvas. The colors twisted and darkened, and the portrait warped further, its serene visage replaced by something more malevolent. The painted Allarian now bore a faint sneer, his eyes gleaming with a cruel, calculating light. The shadows around the edges of the painting deepened, crawling outward like tendrils. Allarian stumbled back, his pulse racing. The portrait no longer reflected him. It reflected something darker, something tainted. Ahead, the hallway became wide and curvy through the 7-story building, signifying the transformation from a retail buyer to a retailer. His father's final words echoed in his mind. "Beware the portrait. It is more than it seems. It watches, and it knows." Allarian stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cold air of the chamber biting at his skin. Slowly, a resolve began to form within him, hardening like iron. "No more lies," he muttered, his voice low but firm. "No more whispers, no more shadows." He turned from the portrait, his jaw set. Whatever had twisted his father's legacy, whatever chaos-fueled conspiracy had wormed its way into his bloodline, he would find it, and he would destroy it. He moved to the desk near his window and retrieved parchment, ink, and a quill. He began to write furiously, outlining the key players at court, recalling moments and conversations that now seemed suspect. His mind worked swiftly, piecing together fragments of memory and insight into a web of connections. As the hours passed, his thoughts returned to his uncle, King Halthar. The pieces aligned too well: the swift ascension to power, the poisoned whispers of betrayal, the court mage's prophecy of a serpent within the bloodline. If Halthar had conspired to murder his own brother, Allarian would see him undone. The prince set the quill down, his hands trembling with barely contained anger. He strode to the window, staring out into the darkness. The moon hung high, its pale light casting an eerie glow over the courtyard below. Somewhere in the labyrinth of corridors and chambers, his uncle no doubt slept soundly, secure in his throne. "Not for long," Allarian vowed. "I swear, Father, I will uncover the truth. I will avenge you, no matter the cost." His hand tightened into a fist, his nails biting into his palm. He thought of his father's face in the portrait, the sorrow in his spectral eyes as he was drawn into the canvas. That image would haunt him, a constant reminder of the burden he now carried. Allarian turned to the painting one last time. The warped version of himself stared back, its cruel smile almost mocking. "Whatever you are," he whispered to the portrait, "whatever power you hold, I will use it if I must. But I will not fall as my father did." The shadows in the room seemed to shift, though Allarian told himself it was only his imagination. He turned away, extinguished the dying embers on the hearth, and climbed into bed. Sleep would not come easily, but he welcomed the chance to plan and prepare. The road ahead would be treacherous. Deceit and danger lay in every shadow, every corridor. But Allarian had made his choice. He would walk that road with his head held high and his father's memory burning in his heart. And when he reached the end, there would be no mercy for those who had betrayed him. Chapter 6. Web of Lies. The morning light seeped through the narrow windows of Torhalen's halls, pale and cold, as though reluctant to pierce the gloom that gripped the castle. Allarian rose early, his mind already racing with questions that demanded answers. His oath had been made, and now it was time to act. He began his investigation subtly. The court was a maze of whispers and hidden agendas, and Allarian knew better than to confront his uncle outright. Instead, he sought out the threads that bound the story of his father's death, hoping to unravel the lies hidden within. The healer's tale. His first stop was the infirmary. The royal healer, an elderly man named Morin, had been the one to tend to King Edric in his final days. Morin's chambers were cluttered with vials, herbs, and scrolls, their once meticulous organization disrupted by time and disuse. "Morin," Allarian began, his voice calm but firm, "I need you to tell me about my father's illness." The healer looked up from his work, startled. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. "Your father? It was a sudden sickness, my lord. Fever, weakness, and, well, he passed quickly." Allarian narrowed his eyes. "So quickly that no one questioned it? My father was strong, Morin, hardly a man to succumb so easily." Morin hesitated, his gaze darting to the door. "It's not my place to speak ill of the dead, or to question the decisions of the living." But having sat with the lost brother, his heart broke. "What decisions?" Allarian pressed. "Speak plainly." The old man sighed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There were orders, my lord, to keep the king comfortable, but to avoid certain remedies that might have prolonged his life." "What is from whom?" Morin's face paled, and he lowered his eyes. "The crown." Allarian's chest tightened. The crown. His uncle. He left the infirmary with a cold knot of anger tightening in his gut. The servant's memory. Next, Allarian sought out a servant who had been present during his father's final days. A young woman named Lissa, her hands rough from years of menial labor, seemed reluctant to speak at first. "Please, my lord," she said, keeping her head bowed, "I don't wish to get involved in such matters." "You're already involved, Lissa," Allarian said gently. "You served my father. If there's anything you know, anything you saw, I must hear it." She hesitated, then nodded. "The night before the king passed, there was an argument. I heard raised voices from the king's chambers. I couldn't make out the words, but it was your uncle and the king. They were angry. What happened after? The next morning the king was gone, she said, her voice trembling, and your uncle gave orders that no one was to speak of the argument. Allarian felt his fists clench at his sides. His father and Halthar had quarreled the night before his death, a detail conspicuously absent from the official accounts. The steward's records say Allarian's final stop was the steward, a meticulous man named Kalor who maintained the royal records. Under the pretense of reviewing administrative matters, Allarian sifted through the documents pertaining to the days surrounding his father's death. "What are you looking for, my lord?" Kalor asked, his tone wary. "The details," Allarian replied, scanning the parchment before him. "Why, for instance, was my father's death not recorded as suspicious? Why was no investigation conducted?" Kalor stiffened. "It was deemed unnecessary. His Majesty King Halthar assured us there was no foul play. And you took his word without question?" Kalor hesitated, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Not everyone believed him, my lord. But those who did not found themselves dismissed, or worse." The prince's eyes darkened. "Worse?" Kalor said no more, but his silence spoke volumes. The web tightens. As the day wore on, Allarian's discoveries began to form a picture of deceit, manipulation, and a concerted effort to bury the truth. His father's death had been no accident, no natural illness. It had been a carefully orchestrated act, and his uncle's fingerprints were all over it. But the question remained, why? Halthar had claimed the throne with the backing of the court, presenting himself as a stabilizing force after Edric's untimely death. Yet whispers of discontent lingered. Allarian had always known his uncle to be ambitious, but to murder his own brother? To align himself with forces as dangerous as chaos? And Rhys Balu. The stakes were far greater than Allarian had imagined. This was not merely a battle for the throne. It was a battle for the soul of the kingdom itself. That night, as Allarian returned to his chambers, he stared once more at the cursed portrait. The painted figure smirked back at him, its eyes gleaming with a dark amusement. The lies were thick, and the truth remained elusive, but Allarian had resolved to pull at every thread, no matter where it led or how tangled the web became. Chapter 7. The Painted Pact. The chill of the castle's lower halls bit at Allarian as he descended into the depths of Tor Helen. The court mage Galvaris had summoned him under mysterious circumstances, sending a note sealed with a sigil that pulsed faintly with energy. It contained only 4 words. "The portrait is key." Allarian clutched the note tightly, his mind racing as he pushed open the heavy wooden door leading to the mage's sanctum. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of incense and the hum of unseen power. Strange artifacts and scrolls cluttered the space, and in the center, Galvaris stood before a glowing rune-inscribed table, his hood drawn low. "You came," Galvaris said, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. "Good. We have little time." "What do you know of the portrait?" Allarian demanded, stepping forward. "Why did my father leave it to me, and what is its connection to everything?" Galvaris motioned for him to approach the table. On its surface was a mirror-like orb swirling with iridescent colors that shifted like oil on water. "The portrait," the mage began, "is no ordinary gift. It is a conduit, a creation of both mortal and chaos magic." Allarian tensed. "Chaos magic? My father would never—" "Not willingly," Galvaris interrupted. "But the artist who painted it, Altharus the Arcane, was no mere painter. He was a seeker of forbidden knowledge, and his works were imbued with powers beyond comprehension. Your portrait reflects not just your likeness, but the essence of your very soul." Allarian's stomach twisted. What does that mean? The portrait changes with you, Galvaris explained, his tone grave. It reveals truths you may not wish to see, your ambition, your sins, your fears. It grows darker the closer you veer toward betrayal, chaos, and corruption. The prince's mind raced, recalling how the painting had warped after his father's spectral visitation. And yet, he said slowly, it remains untouched by time or decay. My sins, my burdens, they mar the painting, not me. Galvaris nodded. Yes, it protects you, preserving your physical self while bearing the weight of your actions. But such a gift comes with a price. The painted pact. Allarian took a step back, his breath shallow. Why would my father leave me such a cursed thing? Galvaris's expression darkened. Perhaps he saw it as a tool, a weapon to wield against the forces of chaos. But, more likely, he did not know its full nature. Althoris's creations are riddled with hidden purposes, most of which serve the changer of ways. The mention of Tzeentch made Allarian's blood run cold. So the portrait is a trap? Not entirely, Galvaris replied. It is also a mirror. The closer you come to your enemies, those who serve chaos, the more the portrait will change. Its corruption reflects their influence. Then I can use it, Allarian said, his voice growing steadier. I can expose their schemes. The mage's gaze grew sharper. Be warned, Prince. The portrait will aid you, yes, but its power is not benign. The more you rely on it, the deeper its claws will sink into your soul. Allarian stared into the swirling orb on the table, its colors shifting eerily. He thought of his father's ghost, the lies that had unraveled in the past days, and the warped image of himself that now stared down from the canvas in his chambers. I have no choice, he said finally. If this portrait can reveal the truth, then I will use it, whatever the cost. Galvaris inclined his head, his tone turning somber. Then, you must make the pact. What pact? Allarian asked, though he already suspected the answer. Touch the orb, Galvaris instructed, gesturing to the swirling artifact. It will bind your will to the portrait, deepening its connection to your soul. Only then will you unlock its full potential. The pact sealed. Allarian hesitated for a moment, then reached out. His fingers brushed the orb's surface, and a shock of energy raced up his arm. The swirling colors grew brighter, enveloping the room in a kaleidoscope of light. A voice, soft, serpentine, and far too familiar, whispered in his mind, "We see you, Prince, and we await your fall." He pulled his hand away, gasping, as the orb dimmed. Galvaris regarded him solemnly. "It is done." "What now?" Allarian asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Watch the portrait closely," Galvaris said. "It will guide you to the truth, but do not trust it blindly. Its power is both your ally and your greatest threat." Allarian nodded, his resolve hardening. The path ahead was treacherous, but he had no choice. He would use the portrait, the lies it revealed, and the power it granted to unravel the conspiracy that had claimed his father's life. But in the shadows of his heart, a seed of doubt began to grow. Could he wield such a weapon without becoming the very thing he sought to destroy? Chapter 8. Shadows in the Court. The arrival of Lady Valine was as unexpected as the storm that swept over Tor Halen that evening. Rain lashed against the high windows of the grand hall, and the distant roll of thunder punctuated the already heavy atmosphere. The court had gathered for a council session, but conversation quickly hushed as the doors creaked open, revealing a cloaked figure flanked by guards. Lady Valine stepped into the hall with the grace of a predator. Her dark, flowing gown shimmered faintly, as though woven with threads of moonlight, and her pale features were framed by hair as black as midnight. but it was her eyes that held the room's attention, piercing and unsettling. They seemed to see more than what was visible. "I am Veline of Carathren," she announced, her voice calm yet commanding. "I have come bearing truths that you would be wise to hear." The assembled nobles exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers drowned out by another crack of thunder. King Halthar, seated on the throne, leaned forward with a faint smirk. "And what truths might those be, Lady Veline?" he asked, his tone both curious and condescending. "Do enlighten us." Valine's gaze swept over the room, lingering briefly on Allarian before returning to the king. "Truths that concern the shadows creeping ever closer to your kingdom," she said. "The very shadows that took your brother's life." The hall erupted in murmurs, and Allarian felt his pulse quicken. Halthar's smirk faltered, replaced by a guarded expression. "You speak boldly, Lady Veline," he said, his voice measured, "but such accusations demand evidence." Veline stepped closer, her movements unhurried. "I am no mere peddler of accusations, Your Majesty. I am a seer, and the threads of fate have shown me much." She turned to the nobles, her voice rising. "Chaos stirs within these walls. Its agents walk among you, cloaked in deception. They have already claimed one life, and they will not stop until this court lies in ruin." The prince's suspicion. Allarian studied her closely, his mind racing. Valine's arrival could not be a coincidence. Her words aligned too closely with what he already suspected. But who was she? And why had she come now? He stepped forward, drawing the room's attention. "If what you say is true, Lady Veline, then surely you can offer more than vague warnings. Who are these agents of chaos? What do you know of their plans?" The next moment came from Peter. "Does Lady Veline know of their plans?" Valine's gaze locked with his, and for a moment it felt as though she were peering into his very soul. "You are bold, Prince Allarian," she said softly, her tone almost amused. "But boldness alone will not uncover the truth." Her eyes flicked briefly to the corner of the hall, where the court mage Galvaris stood watching in silence. "I see many threads of fate converging here. Threads of ambition, betrayal, and power." Halthar rose from his throne, his expression one of calculated skepticism. "You claim to see much, Lady Veline, but I see only riddles and theatrics. If you have nothing more to offer, I suggest you take your leave." Veline smiled faintly, unshaken by his words. "Very well, Your Majesty, but heed my warning. The path you walk is not your own. The changer of ways weaves its schemes, and you are but a pawn in its game." Her parting words sent another wave of murmurs through the hall. Halthar's eyes narrowed, and he gestured for the guards to escort her out. But as Veline turned to leave, she paused beside Allarian, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "Beware the serpent that hides in plain sight, my prince, and beware the mirror. It shows not just your truth, but theirs." A meeting in the shadows. Later that night, as the storm raged on, Allarian found Veline waiting for him in the castle gardens, her cloak drawn tightly around her. He had sent a discreet message requesting an audience, and she had obliged. "You have questions," she said without preamble, her piercing eyes glinting in the moonlight. "I have many," Allarian admitted, "but I'll start with this. Why have you come here, and how do you know so much about what's happening in this court?" Valine's expression softened, though her guarded demeanor remained. "Because, like you, I am searching for answers. The death of your father was no random tragedy, and the conspiracy that surrounds it reaches far beyond these walls. I have seen Chaos's hand at work before, and I will not let it consume another kingdom." "And what is your stake in this?" Allarian pressed. "Why risk your life to warn us?" Veline hesitated, her gaze turning distant. "Let us just say I owe a debt. one I intend to repay." "And what of the portrait?" he asked, his voice dropping. "You mentioned it before. What do you know of its power?" Velini's eyes darkened. "The portrait is both a gift and a curse. It reveals the truth, but it also binds you to it. The more you uncover, the heavier its burden will become." Allarian's grip on the hilt of his dagger tightened. "Then tell me what I need to do." Bellini stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Follow the shadows, my prince. Watch the faces of those who smile too easily, who speak too freely. The agents of chaos are masters of deception, but they cannot hide their true nature forever." She turned to leave, but paused. "And remember this, the greatest threat may not be your enemies. It may be the power you choose to wield." As she disappeared into the shadows, Allarian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Lady Veline had given him much to consider, and much to fear. But one thing was certain. The web of lies he was unraveling had grown darker, and the threads of chaos were woven deeper than he had ever imagined. Chapter 9. Masks of the Masquerade. The castle of Tor Halen had never looked more alive. The Masquerade Ball was an event of unparalleled splendor, its opulence masking the simmering tensions that had plagued the court. The great hall glittered with light from countless chandeliers, their crystals refracting golden warmth over guests dressed in elaborate finery. Masks of every shape and design adorned the nobles' faces, some playful, others sinister, and all concealing the true motives lurking beneath. Prince Allarian stood at the edge of the hall, his mask a simple design of black and gold that framed his sharp features. From his vantage point, he could observe the ebb and flow of the crowd, every conversation and subtle gesture. This was no mere ball. It was a trap of his own design, a chance to sift through the murk of courtly intrigue and expose the serpent coiled within. "Do you see anything of note, my lord?" a voice murmured beside him. Lady Veline, her own mask a delicate filigree of silver that mirrored the moonlight, had appeared at his side with her usual quiet grace. "Not yet," Allarian replied, his eyes scanning the room, "but the night is young." Veline tilted her head, her gaze flicking toward the far end of the hall where King Halthar sat on an ornate dais, his mask a lion's visage crowned with gold. "Your uncle plays the role of king well," she said. "Too well." Allarian followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "He's been playing it since my father's death." "Then perhaps tonight the masks will slip," Valen whispered before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Allarian alone with his thoughts. The deadly exchange. The evening wore on, the music and laughter swelling as wine flowed freely. Dancers spun across the marble floor in a blur of color, their movements graceful yet frenetic. Allarian moved through the throng, his ears tuned to the conversations around him. Most were idle chatter, the usual gossip of court, but occasionally a phrase or tone hinted at something deeper. He paused near a shattered alcove, drawn by the sight of two masked figures locked in a heated, whispered exchange. One wore the mask of a raven, its beak sharp and ominous. The other bore a serpent's visage, its scales glittering in the low light. "You grow reckless," the serpent hissed, their voice low but sharp. "If he suspects—" "It suspects nothing," the raven interrupted. "The plan proceeds as it must. Do not forget your place." Allarian stepped closer, his pulse quickening. Before he could hear more, the raven turned sharply, their gaze sweeping the room. Allarian froze, ducking into the shadows. The raven lingered for a moment before nodding to the serpent and disappearing into the crowd. The serpent lingered, their body tense. Then, with a flick of their wrist, they drew a slender blade from their sleeve and turned toward the alcove. Allarian's breath caught, as another masked figure approached, a servant, their tray of goblets held high. The serpent moved swiftly, the blade flashing as it struck. The servant crumpled to the ground, their tray clattering loudly enough to draw attention. Gasps erupted around the room as guests turned to see the commotion. The serpents slipped into the crowd, vanishing before anyone could identify them. Allarian pushed forward, his heart racing, but the chaos of the ball made pursuit impossible. The servant's lifeless body lay sprawled on the marble floor, their mask shattered. The blade was gone, the assassin's work quick and clean. But in the flickering light, Allarian noticed something. The faint outline of a symbol etched into the servant's collar, hidden beneath the fabric. A mark of chaos. The suspicions deepened. The body was quickly removed, and the ball resumed, though the air was now thick with unease. Allarian retreated to the edge of the hall, his thoughts racing. The serpent and the raven, agents of chaos, no doubt, had revealed much in their brief exchange. But who were they, and what was their plan? Elaine appeared beside him once more, her expression grim. "Did you see?" Allarian nodded. "They killed a servant to send a message. The question is, to whom?" Valini's gaze shifted to the dais, where Haltar sat, watching the crowd with an unreadable expression. "Your uncle remains calm, almost too calm." Allarian followed her gaze, his suspicions deepening. Halthar's demeanor was indeed peculiar, as though he knew more than he let on. The serpent's words echoed in Allarian's mind. If he suspects... The mask slips. As the ball began to wind down, Allarian made his way to the dais, his mask still concealing his face. Halthar greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoying the festivities, nephew?" the king asked, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "Immensely," Allarian replied, his tone measured, "though it seems some of our guests are less than well-mannered." Halthar raised an eyebrow, his expression feigning ignorance. "Oh? What do you mean?" Allarian leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "A servant lies dead, uncle, and yet you sit here, untouched by concern. Curious, isn't it?" Halthar's smile faltered. Just for a moment. But it was enough to confirm Allarian's suspicions. The mask had slipped, and behind it lay something cold and calculating. "You should be careful with your words, boy," Halthar said softly, his tone laced with menace. "Masks can hide many things, but so can faces." Allarian straightened, his resolve hardening. "Indeed they can. And one day, uncle, we'll see which face you truly wear." As he turned and walked away, Allarian knew one thing for certain. The serpent's coil was tightening, and its head pointed directly at the throne. The throne rose, a middle-aged man. Chapter 10. Blood and Betrayal. The dim glow of a single lantern illuminated the stone steps leading to the royal vault, the air growing colder with each descending step. Allarian's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts a tangle of suspicion and dread. The events of the Masquerade had confirmed his worst fears. Chaos's influence had infiltrated the court, and all signs pointed toward his uncle, King Halthar. Now, he sought proof. Lady Valine's whispered advice had led him here, to the heavily guarded vault where the kingdom's treasures and secrets were stored. He had dismissed the guards under the pretense of inspecting an inventory of royal heirlooms. But his true purpose was far more dangerous. The iron door of the vault stood before him, its surface engraved with ancient runes of protection. Allarian pressed the seal of his house into the lock, and the mechanisms groaned as the door swung open. The stale air within carried the faint scent of old parchment and metal, mingled with something sharp and acrid that made his nose wrinkle. Inside, shelves lined with relics, scrolls, and jewels gleamed faintly in the lantern light. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary collection of royal treasures, But Allarian knew better. He moved deeper into the vault, searching for anything out of place. It didn't take long. The cache of Tzeentchian relics. At the far end of the vault, hidden behind a curtain of heavy tapestries, Allarian discovered a small, locked chest. Unlike the other items in the vault, the chest was unmarked, its surface smooth and black, with no sign of its origins. A sense of foreboding prickled at the back of his neck as he examined it. Using a dagger, Allarian pried the lock open. The chest resisted, but with a final crack, the latch gave way. Inside, his breath caught at the sight before him. The contents were unmistakably tied to chaos. A dagger with a hilt shaped like a serpent's coil glinted in the light, its blade etched with runes that seemed to shimmer and shift when viewed too long. Alongside it lay a cluster of crystalline feathers, each one glowing faintly with an unnatural blue light. There was also a small book bound in pale leather, its pages filled with arcane symbols and diagrams, rites dedicated to the Changer of Ways. Allarian's hands shook as he examined the relics. These were no ordinary trinkets, they were artifacts of Tzeentch, each pulsing faintly with the taint of chaos. The cache was undeniable proof that someone within the royal family had ties to the great schemer. "By Sigmar," Allarian muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. He carefully lifted the book, its weight unnatural for its size. The faint whispers of an alien language tickled at the edges of his mind, urging him to open it. He resisted, snapping the chest shut instead. Whoever had hidden these items here had done so with purpose, whether to wield their power or to conceal their crime. The ties to Halthur. As he rose to leave, Allarian noticed a slip of parchment tucked beneath the chest. Unfolding it, he found a sigil drawn in black ink, a serpent coiled around a sword, the emblem of House Halthar. Beneath the sigil were words written in a language he didn't recognize, but the handwriting was clear. His uncle's. The knot of suspicion that had grown in Allarian's chest now solidified into grim certainty. The cache of chaos relics, hidden here under layers of secrecy, could not have been placed without Halthar's knowledge. The king's ambitions, his willingness to seize the throne after Edric's death, now pointed to a far darker truth. Halthar was not merely complicit in Chaos's schemes, he was an agent of it. Allarian clenched his fists, his mind reeling. His uncle had not only betrayed their family, but had jeopardized the kingdom itself. And if Tzeentch's influence ran this deep, there was no telling how many others at court were involved. A grim decision. The prince replaced the chest and concealed it once more, ensuring no sign of his intrusion remained. As he left the vault, his thoughts turned to the portrait hanging in his chambers. He wondered how it might have changed in the wake of his discovery, whether the corruption it reflected had deepened. Standing at the threshold of the vault, Allarian paused. His father's ghost, the prophecy of the court mage, the whispered warnings of the lean, all of it led to this moment. The web of lies that surrounded him had a clear architect, and its threads were tightening around his uncle. But exposing Halthar would not be easy. The king's influence was vast, and Allarian had no allies he could fully trust. To challenge his uncle openly would be to risk everything, his honor, his life, and the future of the realm. "I swear," Allarian whispered into the darkness, his voice steady. "I will see this through. If it takes blood, so be it." The vault door groaned shut behind him, the relics within once again hidden from the world. But the truth they revealed could not be buried. Not anymore. As Allarian ascended the stairs back to the castle proper, the weight of his discovery bore down on him. The battle ahead would be long and perilous, but he would not falter. For his father, for his kingdom, for the truth. Chapter 11. The Face in the Frame. The tension in Torhaling had reached a fever pitch. Allarian had spent sleepless nights piecing together the fragments of treachery uncovered in the royal vault, but with each discovery the danger grew. Chaos's shadow loomed larger, and the risk of exposure was no longer confined to his uncle. Allarian himself was now walking a razor's edge. The first crack in his resolve came on a cold, moonlit night. Lady Valine had sent word of a servant who had been seen loitering near the vault after Allarian's clandestine visit. The young man, a kitchen porter named Jory, was known for his loose tongue. If he had seen or overheard anything, the entire court could be tipped off, and the cache of chaos relics would be discovered before Allarian could act. That could not be allowed. The confrontation. The encounter took place in a secluded courtyard, the shadows thick under the glow of flickering torches. Allarian had summoned Jory under the pretense of questioning him about missing supplies, but his true purpose lay hidden beneath his calm exterior. The porter arrived, his steps hesitant, his face pale in the cold. "My lord," he stammered, bowing awkwardly. "You wished to see me?" Wrath chuckled. Allarian studied the boy, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of deceit. "Yes, Jory, I heard you were near the royal vaults recently." Jory's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't mean anything by it, my lord. I was just delivering a cask of wine for the steward as ordered." "And yet," Allarian said softly, stepping closer, "you lingered." The boy took a step back, his hands trembling. I swear, my lord, I didn't hear anything. I saw nothing. Please, I didn't mean—" "You've seen too much, Jory," Allarian interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "and in times like these, seeing too much can be deadly." The boy's eyes darted to the courtyard gate, his intention to flee clear. But Allarian was faster. Before Jory could turn, the prince drew his dagger, the blade glinting in the torchlight. "Please, my lord," Jory begged, tears streaming down his face. "I won't tell anyone, I swear it." Allarian hesitated for the briefest moment, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. But his resolve was already hardened. The boy's death was a necessity, a cruel but vital act to preserve his mission. "I'm sorry," Allarian whispered, and plunged the blade into Jory's chest. The boy gasped, his body jerking once before collapsing into Allarian's arms. The life drained from his eyes as his blood seeped into the cobblestones, pooling in the cracks like spilled ink. Allarian lowered the body gently to the ground, his hands trembling as he stared at the crimson stain spreading across the stone. The marred portrait. Back in his chambers, the weight of the murder bore down on Allarian. His hands, scrubbed clean of blood, still felt stained. He paced the room, his thoughts a storm of guilt and justification. It had been necessary, he told himself. There was no other way. His eyes drifted to the portrait above the fireplace. He froze. The painting had changed again. The image of himself was now grotesque, the face twisted into a cruel smirk. The once bright eyes were darker, almost feral, and the skin bore faint streaks of red, as though blood had been painted into the strokes. The figure's hands, his hands, were stained crimson, the color vivid and unyielding. Allarian felt bile rise in his throat. The painting was a reflection of his soul, and with Jory's death it had become more corrupted. The man hesitated before replying. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice shaking. And yet, as he caught his reflection in the mirror across the room, his outward appearance was unchanged. His skin was smooth, his eyes clear. No hint of the monstrous visage in the painting marked his physical self. It was as though the portrait had absorbed the sin, sparing him the visible consequences. The burden of power. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the marred image in the frame. Allarian sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He thought of his father, of the honor and integrity the old king had upheld, and how far he had strayed from that path. But there was no turning back now. Chaos had sunk its claws into the heart of the kingdom, and if he faltered, the court would descend into ruin. Juri's death was a sacrifice, one of many, perhaps, that the battle demanded. And the portrait loomed above him, a silent judge and witness to his descent. Allarian stared at it, his resolve hardening once more. He would bear the cost, no matter how steep, if it meant saving his kingdom. "Let the portrait take the weight," he murmured to himself. "I will remain strong." But deep in his heart, he wondered how much longer he could carry the burden, and whether, when the battle was over, there would be anything left of himself to save. He was himself in this condition. Chapter 12. A Gilded Facade. The court was abuzz with whispers, the gilded halls of Torhalen alive with tension. Though Allarian kept his composure, he could feel the undercurrent of suspicion growing against him. The events of the Masquerade had stirred unease, but it was the servant's mysterious death that had set the court aflame with gossip. Now, King Haltar moved with subtle precision, fanning the flames of doubt while keeping his own hands clean. Allarian had expected his uncle to retaliate eventually, but the speed and ferocity with which Haltar acted caught him off guard. The accusation. It was during a council session in the throne room that the first strike came. The chamber was crowded with nobles, their expressions wary as they listened to the court priest, Father Roran, address the assembly. His voice was a booming baritone laden with conviction and zeal. Perception slowly returned. The Empire was at war. "My lords and ladies," Roran began, his tone heavy with sorrow, "dark times are upon us. Chaos stirs within our walls, threatening to poison the very heart of this kingdom. And worse yet, there are whispers that the corruption extends to those of noble blood." The room erupted into murmurs, the nobles glancing at one another with wide eyes. Allarian's pulse quickened as he felt the weight of their gazes slowly shifting toward him. Haltar, seated on the throne, raised a hand to silence the room. "Speak plainly, Father," he said, his voice calm but tinged with authority. "Who do you accuse?" Roran turned, his gaze locking onto Allarian. "Prince Allarian," he said, his voice ringing out like a hammer striking an anvil. "There are those who have seen him lurking in the shadows, consorting with dark forces. The death of the servant boy, an innocent, taken under suspicious circumstances, is but the latest evidence of his descent." Allarian's heart thundered in his chest. He stepped forward, his voice firm but controlled. "These accusations are baseless, Father. I have done nothing to harm this kingdom. My only loyalty is to the crown and to the memory of my father." Roran's expression hardened. "Then why were you seen near the royal vault on the night of the boy's death? Why did you seek an audience with the court mage, a man whose reputation is clouded with whispers of sorcery?" The room erupted again, the nobles' murmurs growing louder. Allarian clenched his fists, his mind racing for a response. "Enough," Halthar said, his voice cutting through the din. He rose from the throne, his expression grave. "This matter is too grave to be dismissed without investigation. My nephew's loyalty has always been beyond question, but even he must answer for these claims." Allarian's jaw tightened. His uncle's words sounded reasonable, even fair, but he knew they were a trap. Haltar was using the court priest as a pawn, framing Allarian as a heretic to erode his standing among the nobles. The court's dows. As the council dispersed, Allarian found himself surrounded by whispers and cold stares. Where once he had been regarded as the kingdom's promising heir, he now saw doubt in the eyes of those who had once supported him. All five of the council. Lady Valine intercepted him in the corridor, her face shadowed by concern. "Your uncle moves quickly," she said, her voice low. "He knows the court will not side with a man tainted by accusations of heresy." He smiled softly at Maurice. "I read his thoughts with intensity." "All lies," Allarian growled, his frustration boiling over. "And yet they believe him." "Because they fear chaos more than they value truth," Valine replied. "If you do not act swiftly, their fear will drown you." Allarian nodded, though his mind was clouded with anger. His uncle's manipulation was ruthless, and the court priest's fervor made the accusations all the more damning. He needed a way to discredit them, quickly and decisively. The portrait's warning. That night, Allarian returned to his chambers, his anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He stared at the portrait above the hearth, its twisted visage reflecting his inner turmoil. The painted image seemed darker than ever, the smirk more pronounced, the eyes gleaming with an unsettling light. "You know," he muttered, as though the portrait could hear him. "You've seen it all. What would you have me do?" The room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Yet as Allarian gazed into the painting, he felt a faint whisper at the edge of his mind, like a shadow brushing against his thoughts. "Strike first." He straightened, his resolve hardening. If his uncle sought to paint him as a heretic, then Allarian would reveal Halthar's true colors before the court. He would expose the cache of chaos relics in the vault, the proof of Halthar's treachery and his pact with the Changer of Ways. But the risks were immense. To accuse the king without irrefutable evidence would mean certain death, and even with proof, the court's fear of chaos might still lead them to turn on him. Yet Allarian saw no alternative. His reputation was already crumbling, and the longer he waited, the closer he would come to ruin. A gilded facade. The next morning, Allarian stood at the window of his chambers, watching the court below as it bustled with activity. To the untrained eye, the kingdom was thriving, its gilded halls and bustling markets a testament to its prosperity. But Allarian saw the truth beneath the facade. A kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos, its foundations riddled with lies and corruption. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, his expression grim. If he was to survive, if he was to honor his father's legacy, he would have to shatter the gilded illusion and reveal the rot within. The battle for the throne was no longer just a fight for power. It was a fight for the soul of the kingdom, and Allarian would not lose. Chapter 13. Lady Valine's Warning. The shadows of Tor Halen were deeper than usual that night. Clouds smothered the moonlight, leaving the castle's corridors cloaked in darkness. Allarian moved cautiously, his footfalls muffled by the thick carpets, as he made his way to the secluded chamber where Lady Valine had summoned him. The urgency of her note left little doubt. Something had shifted, and it was no small matter. "Calthiter?" He entered the chamber quietly, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. Valine stood at the far end of the room, her back to him, framed by the faint glow of a single candle. Her black cloak draped over her shoulders, and her posture was tense, as though bracing against unseen forces. "You came," she said, her voice low and heavy with uncharacteristic weariness. He nodded. "I nearly didn't," Allarian replied, closing the door behind him. "Your note was cryptic. What's so urgent that it couldn't wait until morning?" Valine turned to face him, her pale features illuminated by the candlelight. Her expression was unlike anything Allarian had seen before. Vulnerable, almost desperate. "Captain Viv," he said. "We are running out of time," she said softly. "And so are you." The confession. Allarian frowned, his hand tightening on his dagger. "What are you talking about? If you have something to say it plainly." Valine hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that chilled him. "I know about the portrait," she began. "I know what it does to you. I know the power it holds and the price it demands." Allarian's blood ran cold. "How?" Because I have seen such things before, Valine admitted. The portrait is not unique. It is one of many tools used by the servants of the Changer of Ways, tools meant to twist and bind those who wield them. Her words struck him like a blow. Are you saying it is a weapon of chaos? It is far worse than a mere weapon, she said, stepping closer. It is a tether. Every act you take, every step down the path of vengeance, strengthens the portrait's hold on you. It reflects not only your sins, but the influence of chaos itself. Allarian's jaw tightened. And you? How do you know so much about this? Valine looked away, her voice faltering. Because I too have been ensnared? Her confession hung in the air, heavy and damning. Allarian stared at her, disbelief warring with anger. You serve chaos? I did, she admitted, her tone sharp with self-loathing. Once. I was young, foolish, and desperate for power. Tzeentch offered me a way to rise above my station, to see truths hidden from others. But the gifts of the Changer are never freely given. Every boon comes with a price. And what is your price? Allarian asked coldly, his hand still resting on his blade. Valine met his gaze, her eyes glinting with pain. My freedom. My soul. I have spent years trying to sever the chains that bind me, but they run deep. The schemes of Tzeentch are endless, and even now I can feel its influence pulling at me. The warning. Allarian stepped back, his mind reeling. And yet you stand here, advising me, warning me. Why? Because I see in you what I once saw in myself, Valine said. A man who believes he can wield chaos without being consumed by it. But you cannot. No one can. I have no choice, Allarian snapped. If I walk away, Helthor wins. Chaos wins. Perhaps, Valine replied. But staying here will destroy you. The court is already turning against you. Your uncle has woven his lies too tightly, and the longer you remain, the more isolated you will become. Chaos will use that isolation to twist you into its tool, just as it twisted me. What are you suggesting? He asked, his tone bitter. That I flee, abandon my father's kingdom to chaos? For now, yes, she said bluntly. You cannot fight this battle alone, and you cannot win it from within these walls. There is power in retreat, Allarian. Time to gather allies, to learn the truth of the portrait's power, to prepare yourself for the battle to come. Allarian shook his head, his frustration mounting. And what of you? Will you stay here and continue serving chaos? Valini's eyes hardened. No. My service to Tzeentch is over. I will undo the damage I have done, even if it costs me my life. A fractured alliance. Allarian studied her for a long moment, the candlelight casting flickering shadows across her face. He wanted to trust her, to believe in her redemption, but the weight of her confession left him uncertain. You ask me to trust you, he said finally, but you were a servant of chaos. How do I know this isn't another scheme? You don't, Valine said simply. But if you stay, you will fall, and when you do, chaos will devour not just you, but this entire kingdom. That is the truth. Her words lingered in the air, heavy with finality. Allarian's mind churned with conflicting emotions, but one thought rose above the rest. Time was running out. Whether he fled or stayed, he would have to decide soon. The parting. Valine moved to the door, her cloak trailing behind her. Whatever choice you make, do it quickly. Halthar's plans are accelerating, and Tzeentch's schemes will not wait. She paused, her hand on the door. And Allarian? Be careful with the portrait. It is more than it seems. With that, she was gone, leaving Allarian alone in the flickering candlelight. He stared at the empty doorway, his thoughts a tumult of doubt and determination. Beline's warning echoed in his mind, her words cutting through his pride and anger. The battle was no longer one of swords and crowns, it was a battle for his soul. It was the worst age, and the portrait loomed above it all, a silent witness to his every choice. Chapter 14. Shattered Allegiances. The halls of Tor Halen, once a fortress of unity, now echoed with whispers of treachery. The events of the past weeks had fractured the fragile bonds of trust that held the court together, and the name of Prince Allarian was spoken with increasing doubt. Rumors of heresy, dark magic, and secret dealings had taken root, spreading like wildfire among the nobles and servants alike. But Allarian had little time to concern himself with gossip. The truths he had uncovered, the relics hidden in the royal vault, and the confessions of Lady Valine had driven him to the edge of reason. If chaos had infiltrated his family and his kingdom, then he would fight it with any means necessary, even if it meant delving into the very darkness he sought to destroy. The rift among allies. Allarian's once loyal allies had grown distant, their faith in him eroded by the accusations of the court priest and the whispers of the court. Sir Kael, the commander of the royal guard and a trusted friend since childhood, confronted Allarian one evening in the training yard. "What are you doing, Allarian?" Kael demanded, his tone sharp with frustration. "You've always been a man of honor, a prince the people could believe in, but now the court speaks of you in fear." Allarian met his gaze, his expression cold. "Fear is necessary, Kael. If the court doubts me, it is because they do not understand the threat we face." "And what threat is that?" Kael pressed. "Palthar's ambition? The schemes of chaos? Or is it the man you're becoming?" The words struck harder than any blade, but Allarian refused to let the hurt show. "I am doing what must be done," he said firmly. "If that makes me a monster in their eyes, so be it." Kael's jaw tightened, his disappointment palpable. "You're losing yourself, Allarian. And you're losing us." As Kael walked away, the weight of his words lingered. Allarian had hoped that Kael, at least, would stand by him. But now, even his most steadfast ally seemed ready to abandon him. The delve into forbidden magics. That night, in the solitude of his chambers, Allarian turned to the one ally that remained, the portrait. Its twisted visage stared down at him, its eyes filled with an unsettling mix of malice and amusement. The prince retrieved the leather-bound tome he had taken from the chaos cache in the vault, its pages filled with cryptic runes and diagrams. He knew the risks of using such a tool. The court priest's accusations of heresy were already loud enough, and being caught with a tome of chaos magic would confirm their worst fears. But desperation drove him forward. If he was to expose Halthar's treachery and root out chaos, he needed power. Power that could only be gained by understanding his enemy's tools. At last he used a number of laboratory materials and ran several experiments to monitor the creation of Dragon Age. By candlelight, Allarian began to study the tome. The words were foreign, their meanings elusive, but as he read, the symbols seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, revealing fragments of forbidden knowledge. He felt the pull of the book's power, a seductive whisper at the edge of his thoughts. Slowly he rose to his feet. Centering himself, he began to walk backwards toward the stairs, not aware that he was transforming into the backlash of the master's chamber. The price of power. The first spell he uncovered was simple, a ward to cloak his movements, to shield him from prying eyes. The runes glowed faintly as he traced them in the air, and for a moment the room felt still, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The spell worked. He felt its protective veil settle over him, a cloak of shadow that dulled the senses of those who might watch him. But as the magic took hold, a sharp pain lanced through his chest, and he gasped, clutching his side. In the mirror across the room, his reflection wavered, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw the smirking face of the portrait staring back at him. The pain passed, but the warning lingered. The magic he had invoked was not without cost, and the price was one he could feel in his very soul. A court divided. The following day, the fractures in Allarian's alliances became clearer. The nobles avoided him in the great hall, their conversations ceasing when he entered. Even his closest confidants, those who had once fought by his side, now looked at him with suspicion. "You must see what you're doing," Lady Helena, one of the court's more outspoken members, said to him during a tense council meeting. "The court is falling apart, and the people are losing faith in the crown. Your actions are driving this kingdom into chaos." "I am protecting this kingdom," Allarian snapped, his temper flaring. "Would you rather I sit idle while chaos takes root beneath our feet?" Helena's gaze hardened. "You fight chaos, but you act like it. How long before we cannot tell the difference?" Her words stung, but Allarian refused to yield. He left the meeting in silence, his resolve firm. If the court could not see the truth, he would show it to them. And if they stood in his way, he would cut through them, no matter the cost. Shattered allegiances. Alone in his chambers that night, Allarian stared at the portrait. It had changed again, its features darker and more grotesque. The painted eyes glinted with cruelty, and the faint trace of blood marred its edges. "Are you my ally or my curse?" he murmured to the painting, his voice laced with bitterness. The figure in the frame, of course, gave no answer, but its silent presence was enough. Allarian turned back to the tome, his path clear. He would delve deeper into the forbidden knowledge it held, harness the power of chaos itself, if need be, to reclaim his kingdom and avenge his father. But in his heart, he knew the toll it would take. The cracks in his soul were growing wider, and the man he once was, the Prince of Honor, the heir of Edric, was slipping further away. Chapter 15. Threads of Change. The storm that had battered Torhalen the previous night left the castle cloaked in an eerie calm. Allarian, however, felt no such peace. His steps echoed in the shadowed corridors as he made his way to Lady Valine's chambers, her summons urgent and cryptic. The weight of her warnings lingered in his mind, but doubts about her motives had grown sharper since their last meeting. When he entered her chambers, Valine was waiting, her dark cloak cast aside to reveal a simple dress of deep violet. Her usual poise was absent. She stood near the window, her arms crossed tightly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You came," she said, her voice soft but lacking the sharp confidence he had come to expect. "You didn't leave much choice," Allarian replied, closing the door behind him. "What is it this time? Another warning? Another riddle?" Valine turned, her expression heavy with something he couldn't quite place, guilt perhaps, or weariness. "No riddles, Valerian, only the truth." The revelation. Allarian narrowed his eyes, his hand instinctively brushing the hilt of his dagger. "The truth, Valane? You've been speaking in half measure since the moment we met. Why should I trust you now?" "Because you must," she said, stepping closer. "There is more to me than I have told you, more than you could guess. But if I am to help you, you need to know the full truth." "Then speak it," Allarian demanded. "Who are you, really? And what is your connection to chaos?" Valine hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the table beside her. When she spoke, her voice was tinged with sorrow. "I am not just a seer, Allarian. I was, a servant of Tzeentch." Allarian stiffened, his blood running cold. His dagger was halfway out of its sheath before Valine raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I do not serve him any more," she said quickly. "Listen to me." "You dare to claim that after what you've just admitted," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. Do you have any idea what you've just confessed to?" "I do," Valine said, her voice steady despite his anger, "and it is because of that past that I am here trying to stop him. The double agent." She took a deep breath and continued, her tone resolute. "Years ago I sought power, like so many others drawn to Tzeentch's promises. I became a pawn in his schemes, serving as an agent in courts like this one. My role was to manipulate, to spread doubt, and to prepare the ground for Chaos's influence. And now you expect me to believe you've had a change of heart?" Allarian asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes," Valine said simply, "because I saw what serving him truly meant. The people I destroyed, the lives I betrayed, it was all for nothing. Tzeentch offers only lies, twists only truths, and leaves nothing but ruin in his wake. I could not bear it any longer." She met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "I walked away. It cost me everything, my allies, my safety, even my soul. But I swore that I would do whatever I could to undo the harm I caused." Allarian studied her, his mind racing. Her story could be another lie, another layer of manipulation. But there was something in her eyes, a raw vulnerability, that made him pause. "Why tell me this now?" he asked. "Why risk everything by admitting the truth?" "Because the time for half-truths is over," she said. "Halthar is advancing his plans faster than we anticipated. He has grown bold, and his alliance with Chaos is deeper than either of us realized. If we are to stop him, we must act together." A fragile alliance. Allarian sheathed his dagger but kept his hand close. "Suppose I believe you. What exactly are you proposing?" Valine stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The relics in the vault. They are not just tools of Chaos. They are markers, tied to a larger ritual Halthar intends to perform. He plans to bind the kingdom to Tzeentch will, ensuring his rule is eternal." Allarian's jaw tightened. "And you know this because you were part of it." She nodded. "I was meant to ensure the ritual's success, but I turned away before I could be bound to it. I know the pieces he needs, and I know how to stop him." "But at what cost?" Allarian asked. "How can I trust that you're not still working for him, for Chaos?" "You can't," Valine admitted. "But you have no other choice. If you do nothing, Halthar's plan will succeed, and this kingdom will fall to Chaos. If you kill me, you lose the only person who knows the ritual's workings." Silence hung between them, heavy with uncertainty. Finally, Allarian exhaled and nodded. "Fine. We'll work together, but make no mistake. If you betray me, I will not hesitate." Valine inclined her head. "Fair enough." The threads of change. Their uneasy alliance solidified. Valine began outlining the steps needed to uncover and disrupt Halthar's plan. The pieces were scattered throughout the kingdom, hidden in plain sight and guarded by those loyal to the king. Each piece was tied to Tzeentch's power, and their destruction would weaken the ritual's foundation. As Valine spoke, Allarian felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He was aligning himself with a woman who had served Chaos, trusting her to guide him in a battle against forces he barely understood. It was a risk unlike any he had taken before. But in the face of the growing darkness, it was a risk he had to take. "The threads of fate are shifting," Valine said quietly, her gaze distant. "We must be careful. Tzeentch schemes are endless, and even the smallest action can unravel everything." Allarian nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then let's make sure it's his schemes that unravel, and not us." For the first time, Valine smiled, a small, fleeting expression that carried no malice, only determination. The fragile alliance had been forged, but the road ahead would test them both in ways neither could foresee. Chapter 16. Visions of Chaos. The night was heavy with unease, a suffocating stillness hanging over Tor Halen. Allarian sat alone in his chambers, the flickering glow of the hearth casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The portrait loomed above the mantel, an ever-present specter that watched him as he wrestled with the weight of his choices. The changes in the painting had grown more grotesque over time, its warped features reflecting the toll of Allarian's actions. Tonight, however, something was different. The figure in the frame seemed almost alive. Its painted eyes gleamed with malevolent light, and its surface appeared to ripple as though it were a pool disturbed by unseen forces. Allarian rose from his chair, his heart pounding. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. As if in answer, the portrait shuddered. The air grew cold, and a low hum filled the room, resonating deep in Allarian's chest. Then, without warning, the figure in the frame, the portrait's transformation, the grotesque smirk that had haunted Allarian for weeks widened unnaturally, stretching across the painted face. The colors in the painting darkened, the shadows deepening until they seemed to spill from the frame itself. Tendrils of black and blue light coiled outward, wrapping around the edges of the canvas like grasping fingers. Allarian stumbled back, his breath catching as the portrait's surface began to pulse, each beat a grotesque imitation of a living heart. The hum grew louder, resolving into whispers, dozens of voices overlapping, their words unintelligible but heavy with malice. And then the visions began. The final moments of Edric. The room dissolved into darkness, and Allarian found himself standing in a space that was both familiar and alien. The walls of his father's chambers materialized around him, their outlines hazy and indistinct. The air was thick with tension, and the faint scent of smoke lingered. Before him stood his father, King Edric, his proud figure diminished by illness but still radiating a quiet strength. He was seated in his great chair, his hand clutching the armrest as he glared at the man standing before him. Helthar, Allarian's uncle, loomed over Edric, his face twisted with anger. His voice, though muffled by the vision's distortion, carried venom as he spoke. "You are blind, brother," Helthar spat. "You cling to your ideals while the world crumbles around you. Chaos offers us a path to survival, power beyond imagining, and you refuse it out of pride." Edric's response was quiet but firm. "Power bought with chaos is no power at all. It is poison, and you are a fool to think otherwise." Helthar sneered, his hand tightening on the edge of the desk. "Then you leave me no choice. The kingdom needs a ruler who understands the cost of survival." Allarian tried to move, to intervene, but his body remained rooted in place. The vision played out before him as though he were a ghost, powerless to alter what had already passed. Helthar produced a small vial from his cloak, its contents glowing faintly. He uncorked it and poured the liquid into a goblet of wine resting on the desk. "You brought this upon yourself, Edric," he said, his voice cold. "May your death serve the greater good." Edric made a move to rise, but his illness slowed him. Helthar pressed the goblet into his hand, his expression a mockery of concern. "Drink, brother," he said softly. "You need your strength." The vision's climax. The scene shifted, the walls of the chamber dissolving into swirling shadows. Allarian now saw his father lying motionless in his bed, the goblet overturned on the floor. Helthar stood beside the bed, flanked by figures cloaked in blue and gold, agents of chaos, their faces obscured by ornate masks. One of the figures stepped forward, holding a blade aloft. It was inscribed with runes similar to those Allarian had seen in the tome he now kept hidden. The figure gestured toward Edric's lifeless form, murmuring in a guttural language that made Allarian's ears ache. With each word, the shadows around the room grew darker, coiling like serpents. Allarian felt a pull in his chest, as though the vision itself sought to drag him into its depths. "Enough," he shouted, the force of his voice breaking the spell. The portress warning. The vision shattered, and Allarian found himself back in his chambers, gasping for breath. The portrait's grotesque visage stared down at him, its features more twisted than ever. The pulsating light had dimmed, but the whispers remained, a faint echo of the nightmare he had just witnessed. Allarian staggered to the desk, his hands trembling as he gripped its edge. His uncle's betrayal, his father's final moments, all of it had been laid bare. And yet, the portrait's warning was clear. There was more to the story, layers upon layers of schemes that he had yet to uncover. The whispers grew louder for a moment, forming a single chilling phrase. "You are next." Allarian stared at the painting, his resolve hardening. He would not be next. He would not fall as his father had. If Helthar had bound himself to chaos, then Allarian would tear him from its grip, no matter the cost. "Your secrets will not save you," Allarian muttered, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. "I will see you undone, uncle, and chaos with you." Chapter 17. The Trial of Lies. The great hall of Torhalen was heavy with tension, the air thick with anticipation as nobles, priests, and guards gathered to witness the trial. At the center of it all stood Prince Allarian, his hands bound by ceremonial chains as he faced the assembled court. The accusation was clear, but its absurdity made it all the more dangerous. "Allarian Edricsson," proclaimed Father Roran, his booming voice carrying over the crowd, "you stand accused of the most heinous crime, the murder of your own father, King Edric." Gasps rippled through the room, and Allarian clenched his jaw, his gaze darting to his uncle. Halthar sat upon the throne, his expression one of grim disappointment, but Allarian could see the faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. This was a trap, carefully laid and executed with precision, and now the kingdom watched as he stood accused of a crime he did not commit. "I demand the right to speak," Allarian said, his voice firm, cutting through the murmurs. "You will have your chance," Roran replied coldly, "but first we shall hear the evidence." The trial unfolds. The trial began with the presentation of witnesses. A steward was called, a man who had served in the royal chambers for decades. He claimed to have seen Allarian near the king's chambers on the night of Edric's death, his movements suspicious. "I saw the prince leave his father's room late that night," the steward said, his voice trembling. "He looked disturbed. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now—" Next came Lady Helena, a noble who had once been an ally but now seemed all too eager to cast suspicion. "The prince has acted strangely since his return," she said, her tone laced with disdain. "His obsession with the portrait, his secretive meetings, it all points to guilt." Allarian's hands tightened into fists, his anger bubbling beneath the surface. He knew these testimonies were orchestrated by Helthar, but the web of lies was intricate and convincing. Finally, Roran presented a piece of damning evidence, the overturned goblet that had been found in Edric's chambers, its rim stained with poison. "This," the priest declared, holding it aloft, "is the instrument of the king's death. And it was the prince who delivered it." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd, the nobles exchanging uneasy glances. Allarian's pulse quickened. Halthar's plan was working. The court was turning against him. Allarian's defense. When his turn to speak came, Allarian stepped forward, his chains clinking as he moved. He stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice calm but resonant. "These accusations are not just false, they are an insult to the memory of my father. To suggest that I, his son, would poison him is absurd." "You deny the evidence," Roran interjected, his tone sharp. "I deny the lies," Allarian shot back. "The goblet you hold, How convenient that it should surface now, so long after my father's death. And the witnesses? Servants who can be bought, nobles who seek favor with the king, who now sits on the throne. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Allarian turned to the nobles, his gaze piercing. Ask yourselves, who gains the most from these accusations? Who benefits from sowing discord and doubt in this court? His eyes locked with Halthar's, and for a brief moment the king's mask of composure slipped, revealing a flicker of anger. The trickery. Knowing the truth would not be enough to sway the court, Allarian resorted to more desperate measures. He had prepared for this moment, hiding a small vial of powder in his tunic, a relic taken from the chaos cache in the vault. When the time was right, he would use it to create a distraction. He waited for Roran to speak again, then interrupted, feigning a sudden fit. The truth will come to light," he gasped, staggering back as he opened the vial discreetly. A burst of blue smoke erupted, filling the air with a faint, otherworldly glow. The crowd recoiled in shock, cries of alarm echoing through the hall. Allarian used the chaos to his advantage, turning the moment confusion into one of intimidation. "Do you see?" he shouted, his voice echoing. "Chaos is in this court, and it is not me who brought it here. It hides in the shadows, in the lies told to you by those who seek to control you." The smoke began to dissipate, but its impact lingered. The nobles whispered among themselves, their fear palpable. Allarian could see doubt spreading through the room, a small crack in Halthar's carefully constructed narrative. The escape. Before order could be restored, Allarian made his move. He turned to the guards nearest him, fixing them with a commanding glare. "Unchain me," he demanded, his voice filled with authority. "You serve the crown, not the lies of a corrupt priest." The guards hesitated, the power of his words and the fear of the unknown rooting them in place. Finally, one of them stepped forward and unlocked his chains. Allarian rubbed his wrists, then addressed the court once more. "I will not stand trial for a crime I did not commit," he said. "But know this, the truth will come to light, and when it does, those who have conspired against me and against this kingdom will pay the price." With that he turned and strode from the hall, the nobles parting before him like waves. Halthar's voice called after him, sharp and commanding, but Allarian did not look back. His escape had been orchestrated with care, and Valine waited for him in the shadow, a fragile victor. That night, as the castle settled into an uneasy quiet, Allarian regrouped with Velen in a hidden chamber. "You've made yourself a fugitive," she said, her tone neither approving nor condemning. "As part of the plan," Allarian replied, though the weight of the trial still pressed on him. Halthar had shown his hand, but the game was far from over. Now, Allarian's fight would move beyond the court's walls, and in the darkness ahead, the threads of chaos would either strangle him or guide him to victory. Chapter 18. The Portrait's Whisper. The chamber was dark, save for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the narrow windows. Allarian sat at his desk, his hands trembling as he pored over the stolen scrolls Valine had provided. Fragments of rituals, maps of ley lines, and cryptic symbols he could barely understand. The room was cold, yet sweat beaded on his brow. The weight of the trial, his escape, and the ever-tightening noose of chaos hung heavily over him. Above the hearth, the portrait loomed like a shadow given form. The grotesque features of the painted figure seemed more alive than ever. Its smirk had twisted further into a sneer, its eyes gleaming with a dark light that made Allarian's skin crawl. He avoided looking at it as he worked, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger with every passing moment. "You cannot avoid me forever." The voice was soft, a faint whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Allarian froze, his quill falling from his hand. The air in the room grew colder, the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth now a distant hum. "You've always known, haven't you?" the voice said again, its tone laced with dark amusement. Allarian slowly turned toward the portrait. The figure in the frame was no longer still. Its lips moved, curling into a cruel smile as its eyes bore into his. The first exchange. "You're not real," Allarian said, his voice shaking as he rose to his feet. "You're just a reflection, a trick of chaos." "Perhaps," the portrait replied, its voice smooth and serpentine. "But a useful trick, don't you think? I see what you cannot. I know what you refuse to acknowledge." "You want?" Allarian demanded, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his dagger. "Why torment me now?" The portrait chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Torment? Is that what you think this is? No, my dear prince, I am here to guide you." "Guide me?" Allarian's laugh was bitter. "Why should I trust anything you say?" "Because I know what you want," the portrait said, its tone turning softer, more coaxing. "Justice, vengeance, power, and I know how to give it to you." Visions of the past. The air shimmered, and the surface of the painting began to ripple. The grotesque figure blurred, replaced by shifting images that played out like memories. Allarian saw his father again, seated in his study, the weight of the crown pressing down on him. The vision shifted to Halthar, whispering in the shadows with cloaked figures. Each image was fleeting, fragmented, but clear enough to send a shiver down Allarian's spine. "You've always suspected," the portrait said, its voice now tinged with malice. "Your uncle did not act alone. The web of chaos runs deeper than you know." The image shifted again, showing the court priest Roran bowing before an altar. Strange symbols glowed faintly in the darkness, and shadowy figures loomed in the background. "Roran," Allarian muttered, his fists clenching. "He's part of this." "Of course he is," the portrait purred. "A loyal servant of Tzeentch, like so many others in your precious court. But now you see, don't you? The pieces are falling into place. The temptation." Allarian stepped closer to the portrait, his breath shallow. "If you know so much, tell me how to stop them, how to destroy this web of lies." The portrait's smile widened. "You already know the answer. You must become what they fear, a force of chaos to rival their own. Use the power you've tasted. Embrace it." "No," Allarian said sharply, shaking his head. "I won't. I've already seen what it does, how it twists and corrupts." "And yet you've used it before," the portrait whispered. "Did it not save you? Did it not give you the strength to escape the trial, to survive when all seemed lost?" "Oh, it was different," Allarian muttered, his voice faltering. "I had no choice." "There is always a choice," the portrait said, its tone mocking. "And you chose power. Do not delude yourself into thinking you are above it. You crave it, just as your uncle does. The only difference is that you wear a mask of righteousness." Allarian turned away, his chest heaving as he fought to steady his thoughts. The portrait's words cut deep, not because they were entirely false, but because they echoed the doubts he had buried within himself. The portrait's bargain. "You cannot fight this war with honor alone," the portrait said. "If you want to win, you must embrace the tools at your disposal. Let me guide you, and I will show you how to bring them all to their knees." Allarian closed his eyes, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He thought of his father's ghost, the vision of betrayal, the court's lies. He had sworn to avenge Edric, to root out chaos from his kingdom, but at what cost? "If I follow your guidance," he said slowly, "what becomes of me? What am I, if I give in to this?" "You are what you must be," the portrait replied. "A king, a savior, a destroyer of chaos." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Allarian turned back to the portrait, its grotesque visage slowly reappearing as the shifting images faded. "Think on it, my prince. the portrait said, its voice now a faint whisper. "The line between justice and power is thinner than you think." Allarian stood there long after the whispers faded, the weight of the portrait's words heavy in the stillness. He knew the path ahead would demand sacrifices, but he could not yet see where the line would be drawn, or whether he had already crossed. Chapter 19. Veli's Redemption. The night was cold, the wind howling through the dense forest that surrounded Tor Halin. Allarian and Veline moved swiftly through the shadows, their cloaks pulled tight against the biting air. The castle's distant silhouette loomed behind them as they approached an abandoned watchtower, a relic of wars long past, now repurposed by Halthar's agents as a meeting place for their clandestine dealings. "This is the place," Veline whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "The fragment we seek should be inside. It will tell us how to disrupt the ritual." Allarian nodded, his eyes scanning the area for guards. "Are you sure it's here?" "I'm certain," Veline replied, her tone firm. "The tome fragment contains the instructions Halthar needs to complete his ritual. If we can steal it, we'll have a chance to stop him." Despite her confidence, Allarian could see the strain in her expression. The toll of their alliance, the secrets she had revealed, the risks she had taken, had weighed heavily on her. But tonight, she seemed more resolute than ever. The covert mission. The watchtower was surrounded by a small contingent of guards, their torchlight cutting through the darkness. Allarian and Veline waited in the tree line, watching their movements, counting their numbers. "We'll need to be quick," Allarian said. "If they raise the alarm, we won't have time to escape." Veline smirked faintly. "Then we won't let them raise it." They moved as one, slipping through the shadows like phantoms. Veline led the way, her movements precise and deliberate, her knowledge of Halthar's operations evident in every step. Allarian followed, his sword drawn, his senses alert. They reached the base of the tower without incident, dispatching a lone sentry with silent efficiency. Veline gestured toward a narrow stairwell that wound its way to the top. "The fragment will be in the chest at the top," she whispered. "I'll keep watch. Go." Allarian hesitated. "Are you sure? You should come with me." "There's no time to argue," Veline replied, her tone firm. "Go. I'll handle the guard." Reluctantly, Allarian nodded and ascended the stairs. The air grew colder as he climbed, the shadows deepening with each step. At the top, he found a small chamber lit by a single candle. In the center of the room stood an ornate chest, its surface inscribed with arcane symbols. He knelt before it, his heart pounding as he worked to disable the lock. After a tense moment, the chest clicked open, revealing a fragment of a tome bound in pale leather. The pages were filled with cryptic runes and diagrams, their meaning just beyond his grasp. The Betrayal unfolds. As Allarian examined the fragment, a commotion erupted below. The clash of steel and shouts of alarm echoed up the stairwell, his stomach twisted. Veline. He grabbed the fragment and sprinted back down the stairs, his sword at the ready. When he reached the base of the tower, he found Veline surrounded by guards, her dagger flashing as she fought them off. Blood stained her cloak, but her movements were unyielding, her resolve unshaken. Valerian shouted, rushing to her side. "You have the fragment?" she asked, her voice strained but urgent. "Yes, but we need to go, now," he said, cutting down a guard who lunged at him. Veline shook her head, stepping back toward the center of the fight. "I'll hold them off. You need to get out of here." "I'm not leaving you," Allarian shouted. "You must," Veline said fiercely, her eyes blazing with determination. "If they take you, everything we've done will be for nothing." Before Allarian could protest, she thrust a small, folded parchment into his hand. "This will help you understand the fragment. Go." The sacrifice. Allarian hesitated, his heart warring with his instincts, but Veline's expression left no room for argument. She had made her choice. "I'll come back for you," he said, his voice breaking. Veline smiled faintly. a rare softness in her eyes. "No, you won't. But I'll be with you, Allarian." With a final defiant cry, Valine turned back to the guards, her dagger flashing as she fought them with a ferocity that bought Allarian the time he needed to escape. The last thing he saw as he fled into the forest was her silhouette, standing tall against overwhelming odds. Hours later, Allarian stopped to rest in the shelter of a fallen tree. His hands trembled as he unfolded the parchment Valine had given him. It was a crude map, marked with symbols he recognized from the fragment. Beneath the map was a single line of text, written in Valine's hand. "The key to breaking the ritual lies in the first flame. Trust yourself." Allarian clenched the parchment tightly, his grief threatening to overwhelm him. Valine's sacrifice had given him the chance to fight back, but the cost was more than he had ever wanted to pay. As he stared at the fragment, its runes glowing faintly in the moonlight, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Valine had believed in him, even as her own redemption cost her life. He would honor her sacrifice, and he would finish what they had started. For Valine, for his father, for the kingdom. Chapter 20. The Turning Tide. Allarian sat in the small, hidden cave that had become his refuge, the dim light of the fire flickering over the pale pages of the tome fragment. The runes etched into the leather-bound parchment glowed faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm that seemed to match his own heartbeat. Valine's sacrifice weighed heavily on him, her final words echoing in his mind. "The key to breaking the ritual lies in the first flame. Trust yourself." He traced the runes with a trembling finger, piecing together the fragments of the text. The arcane language was dense, its meaning obscured by layers of metaphor and chaos-infused trickery. But amidst the confusion, a pattern emerged. A spell, one powerful enough to sever the bonds Tzeentch had woven into the kingdom. "This is it," Allarian whispered, his voice both awed and wary. "The way to stop them." But the spell came with a price, one that was clear even through the cryptic words. The caster would sacrifice a part of themselves, something vital, something irreplaceable. Allarian knew that such magic was never without cost. The question was whether he was willing to pay it. The spell's revelation. The tome spoke of a ritual fire, one that could consume the tendrils of chaos and sever their influence from those ensnared by it. The spell required 3 key elements: the fragment itself, a source of pure light, and the blood of the caster to anchor the magic. Allarian's eyes lingered on the final instruction. "The blood binds, and the soul pays." He slammed the tome shut, the rune's glow fading as his heart pounded. The implications were clear. The spell would not only drain his strength, but might also take something far deeper, his very humanity, or perhaps his soul itself. As the fire crackled softly, Allarian's thoughts turned to the portrait hanging in his chambers. It had already absorbed so much of his corruption, sparing his outward self from the consequences of his actions. But could it bear the cost of this spell? Or would it shatter under the strain, leaving him to face the full weight of his deeds? The decision. Allarian rose, pacing the confined space of the cave, his mind churned with doubts and fears. Valine's sacrifice had bought him this chance, but the idea of sacrificing himself, of surrendering a part of who he was, terrified him. Yet the faces of those who depended on him flashed in his mind: his father, betrayed and poisoned; Valine, who had given her life for his cause; the countless innocents who would suffer if Halthar's plan succeeded. He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "No more hesitating," he said aloud, his voice firm. "If this is what it takes, then so be it." Gathering the tome and the supplies he had salvaged, Allarian left the cave and began his journey back to Torhalen. The spell had to be performed at the heart of the conspiracy, where the chaos influence was strongest. There could be no turning back. The ritual begins. Under the cover of darkness, Allarian slipped into the castle. The corridors felt unfamiliar, their once welcoming stone walls now seeming to close in around him. He made his way to the great hall, where Halthar had constructed the altar for his grand ritual. The room was eerily quiet, the faint glow of chaos-infused relics casting twisted shadows on the walls. Placing the tome fragment on the altar, Allarian began the preparations. He retrieved a small vial of pure light, a relic Veline had helped him acquire, and placed it beside the tome. Finally, he drew his dagger, its blade gleaming in the dim light. "The blood binds and the soul pays," he murmured, his hand trembling as he pressed the blade to his palm. As his blood dripped onto the tome, the runes flared to life, their light searing and blinding. The air around him grew heavy, charged with power that crackled like a storm. The fire on the altar roared to life, its flames blue and gold, and the shadows in the room writhed as if in agony. The cost. The pain struck him like a lightning bolt, radiating from his chest and spreading through his limbs. Allarian fell to his knees, gasping as the spell tore through him. He could feel it pulling at something deep within, something essential. Memories flashed before his eyes, his father's laughter, his mother's warmth, the moments of joy and hope that had once defined him. The portrait flashed in his mind, its grotesque image twisting further as it absorbed the spell's cost. But it could not take everything. The spell demanded more, and Allarian felt it reaching for his very soul. "No," he gasped, his voice raw. "You will not take me, not all of me." The flames surged, the light blinding, the room filled with a deafening roar as the spell reached its crescendo. And then silence. The tide turns. When Allarian opened his eyes, he was alone in the great hall. The chaos relics were gone, their power extinguished. The air was clear, the oppressive weight of Tzeentch's influence lifted. But he felt hollow, as though a piece of him had been carved away. He staggered to his feet, his vision swimming. In the distance, the castle stirred, the echoes of confusion and fear growing louder. The spell had worked, severing the conspiracy's grip on Tor Halen. But at what cost? As he stumbled back toward his chambers, Allarian caught sight of his reflection in a polished shield. His face was unchanged, his body intact. But his eyes, they were different, darker, as though the light within him had dimmed, leaving behind a shadow that could never be erased. "The tide has turned," he whispered, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But the battle is far from over." Chapter 21. The Feast of Feathers. The great hall of Tor Halen was alive with light and sound as the feast began, a spectacle designed to distract and pacify the court. King Halthar sat at the head of the long table, draped in royal finery, his lion's crest embroidered in gold on his crimson robe. Nobles laughed and toasted, their voices echoing through the vaulted chamber, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. Whispers of betrayal and chaos still haunted the court, and Allarian intended to turn those whispers into a storm. The prince entered the hall late, his presence drawing the attention of every guest. Clad in his ceremonial armor, his dark cloak sweeping the floor, he looked every inch the warrior and heir to the throne, yet his eyes, shadowed and intense, betrayed the weight of his recent struggles. "Ah, nephew," Halthar said, rising with a false smile. "I'm glad you've decided to join us. Tonight we celebrate the unity and strength of our king." Allarian's gaze was cold as steel. "Unity? Strength?" he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Spare us the platitudes, uncle. Tonight we reveal the truth." The confrontation began. The room fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Halthar's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered, gesturing for Allarian to take a seat. "Let us not spoil the evening with such grim talk," he said smoothly. "We are here to feast, not to quarrel." Allarian ignored the gesture and stepped forward, his voice rising. "This is no quarrel, it is a reckoning. I have uncovered evidence that ties you, Halthar, to the death of my father, and to the influence of chaos itself." Gasps rippled through the room, and the nobles turned their wide-eyed gazes to the king. Halthar's expression darkened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "You speak boldly, nephew," he said, his voice laced with menace. "But bold words without proof are nothing more than treason." "I have proof," Allarian retorted, his hand reaching into his cloak. He withdrew the chaos fragment he had recovered from the royal vault, its glowing runes pulsating faintly in the dim light. "This relic was hidden under your protection, alongside others like it. It is a tool of Tzeentch, the changer of ways. You would have used it to bind this kingdom to chaos." The hall erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted over one another, some in disbelief, others in horror. The court priest, Father Rorin, rose to his feet, his face pale. "This is heresy," he bellowed. "You bring chaos into this sacred hall, Prince Allarian. How dare you?" Allarian turned to him, his voice sharp. "Spare me your outrage, Rorin. You are complicit in this treachery. I have seen the visions, the rituals you performed alongside Halthar. Do not pretend innocence." The priest staggered back as the crowd's eyes turned to him. Halthar, however, remained seated, his expression unreadable. "Chaos unleashed?" "You've said enough," Halthar said suddenly, his voice calm but brimming with malice. He rose from his chair, his presence commanding as he addressed the room. "My nephew seeks to sow division, to tear apart this court with baseless accusations. But you see the truth, do you not? He is the one who has consorted with chaos, who carries its tainted relics into our halls." Allarian's hand tightened around the fragment as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Halthar gestured toward him, his voice rising. "Look at him. Does he not bear the mark of corruption? His eyes, his demeanor, they are not the Allarian you once knew. He is lost to chaos." Before Allarian could respond, the lights in the hall dimmed, and the air grew thick with an unnatural energy. The torches flickered, their flames turning blue and gold, and a low hum filled the room. Tzeentch's power had arrived. Shadows writhed along the walls, forming twisted shapes that seemed to move of their own accord. The nobles screamed as the feast table split apart, its surface cracking like ice. Halthar's smirk widened as his form began to change, his features twisting into something monstrous. "So you forced my hand," Halthar growled, his voice deepening into an otherworldly roar. "Very well, nephew. If you wish to see the truth of chaos, then behold it. The battle begins." The room descended into chaos as Halthar's transformation completed. His form was now a grotesque amalgamation of human and beast, his limbs elongating into clawed appendages, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Behind him, Father Rorin fell to his knees, chanting in the guttural language of chaos, as the shadows in the room grew darker. Allarian drew his sword, its blade gleaming in the unnatural light. "This is your legacy, uncle," he shouted, his voice steady despite the terror surrounding him. "Chaos will not claim this kingdom." He lunged at Halthar, their blades clashing with a deafening ring. Around them, nobles scrambled for the exits, their screams filling the air as tendrils of shadow lashed out, pulling some into the darkness. Guards tried to intervene, but their weapons were useless against the swirling chaos energy. Allarian fought with every ounce of strength he had, his sword striking true against Halthar's twisted form, but the power of chaos was overwhelming, and for every blow he landed, Halthar seemed to grow stronger. The fragment's power. As the battle raged, Allarian felt the chaos fragment in his hand pulse with energy. Its runes glow brighter, resonating with the power coursing through the room. He hesitated for a moment, the portrait's whispers echoing in his mind. "You know," he muttered, his grip tightening. "I won't let it consume me." Instead, he raised the fragment and channeled its energy into the room. The shadows recoiled, and the tendrils writhed in agony as the fragment's light pushed them back. Halthar roared, his monstrous form faltering under the assault. At a final surge of strength, Allarian struck, his blade piercing Halthar's chest. The king staggered back, his form convulsing as the chaos energy that sustained him began to unravel. "This is for my father," Allarian said, his voice cold as steel. Halthar let out a final, guttural roar before collapsing, his form dissolving into ash. The room fell silent, the unnatural energy dissipating as quickly as it had come. The nobles stared at Allarian in stunned silence, their faces pale with fear and awe. The prince stood amidst the wreckage of the hall, his sword still in hand, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "It is over," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "The king was a servant of chaos, but his schemes end tonight. This kingdom will be free." Though some still looked at him with doubt, a murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The turning tide had begun, but Allarian knew the battle was far from over. The price of victory weighed heavily on him, but as he looked at the chaos fragment in his hand, he resolved to finish what he had started. Halthar was dead, but Tzeentch still loomed. The fight for the kingdom's soul was not yet won. Chapter 22. A Fractured Reflection. The castle was quiet in the aftermath of the feast, the great hall now a ruined monument to Allarian's victory over Halthar. Yet victory felt hollow. The chaos fragment rested heavy in his pocket, its faint pulse a constant reminder of the darkness he had wielded. Though Halthar was gone, the battle had left scars on the kingdom, and on Allarian himself. He returned to his chambers, exhaustion weighing on him like a leaden cloak. The air felt different as he stepped inside, colder and thicker, as though the room were holding its breath. His gaze fell on the portrait above the mantel. It had changed again. The figure in the frame was no longer a grotesque mockery of his likeness. It had shifted into something far worse. The transformation. The painted figure's smirk was gone, replaced by a twisted snarl that bared jagged teeth. The eyes, once mocking, now burned with hatred, their glow illuminating the darkened room. Shadows rippled across the canvas, the edges of the frame warping as though the portrait were struggling to escape its confines. Allarian took a step back, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. The air crackled with energy, and the whispers that had haunted him grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of malice. "You cannot run from me," the voice came, low and guttural, echoing as though it were both inside and outside his mind. "You cannot hide from what you've become." The canvas bulged outward, the painted figure pressing against its surface. With a sound like tearing fabric, the frame shattered, and the figure stepped out into the room. It was Allarian, and yet it wasn't. The doppelganger was a monstrous reflection, its features exaggerated and grotesque. Its armor was tarnished and cracked, its sword jagged and dripping with black ichor. Its skin glistened as though it were made of liquid shadow, constantly shifting and writhing. The real Allarian drew his sword, his heart pounding. "What are you?" The doppelganger's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I am you," it said. "The you that hides beneath the mask. The you that thirsts for power, for vengeance, for blood." The confrontation. "You're wrong," Allarian said, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at him. "I fight for justice, for my father, for this kingdom." The doppelganger laughed, a hollow, grating sound. "Lies. You tell yourself that to sleep at night, but we both know the truth. Every choice you've made, every step you've taken, has been for yours." He gestured to the shattered frame, the remnants of the portrait smoldering on the floor. "I was your reflection, your burden to bear. But you fed me, Prince. With every sin, every sacrifice, you gave me life." Allarian tightened his grip on his sword. "If you're my reflection, then I'll destroy you. You have no place in this world." The doppelganger's smile widened, its form rippling as it raised its own weapon. "You cannot destroy me, Allarian. To kill me is to kill yourself. But if you insist, let us see who you truly are." With a roar, the doppelganger lunged, its blade clashing against Allarian's with a deafening ring. The force of the blow sent Allarian stumbling back, but he recovered quickly, countering with a swift strike that the doppelganger dodged effortlessly. The fight was brutal and unrelenting, the two figures locked in a deadly dance. The doppelganger matched Allarian's every move, mirroring his techniques but with an unnatural fluidity that made it impossible to gain the upper hand. Each strike, each parry felt like a battle against himself, his weaknesses, his doubts, his darkest impulses. "Do you think you can win this?" the doppelganger taunted, its voice dripping with malice. "You are nothing without me. Every victory you've claimed, every enemy you've slain, those were my victories, my strength." "Enough!" Allarian shouted, his voice filled with fury. He drove forward with a flurry of attacks, his blade slicing through the doppelganger's shifting form. Black ichor spilled from the wounds, but the creature only laughed, its body knitting itself back together. "You cannot kill what you refuse to accept," it hissed. "Face me, Allarian. Face yourself." The breaking point. The doppelganger's words struck a nerve, and Allarian faltered. In that moment of hesitation, the creature disarmed him, sending his sword clattering across the room. It loomed over him, its jagged blade poised to strike. "You are weak," it said, its voice a venomous whisper. "You cannot win because you are afraid. Afraid of what you've become. Afraid of what you'll lose." Allarian closed his eyes, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. The sacrifices, the lies, the blood. He had justified them all in the name of justice, but now those justifications felt hollow. The doppelganger was right. He was afraid. But in that fear he found clarity, acceptance. Allarian opened his eyes, meeting the doppelganger's gaze. "You're right," he said quietly. "I am afraid. I have made mistakes. I have walked the edge of darkness. And I have fallen." The doppelganger tilted its head, its blade lowering slightly. "But I am not you," Allarian continued, his voice steady. "You are a part of me, a reflection of my sins. But you do not define me." With a surge of resolve, Allarian lunged forward, grabbing the doppelganger's blade with his bare hands. The sharp edges bit into his flesh, but he held firm, pulling the creature closer. "You are not my enemy," he said. "You are my burden, and I will carry you." The doppelganger screamed, its form writhing as it began to dissolve. The shadows that had given its shape collapsed inward, pulling the creature back into the remnants of the portrait. The air grew still, and the whispers faded. The aftermath. Allarian fell to his knees, his breath ragged, his hands trembling. The shattered portrait lay before him, its frame scorched and empty. The battle was over, but the scars it left would remain. He rose slowly, his resolve stronger than ever. The fight had shown him the truth. His sins were his own, but so was his strength. He would carry the weight of his actions, not as a curse, but as a reminder of the cost of his choices. As he left the room, the shattered remnants of the portrait smoldered behind him, their faint glow fading into darkness. Chapter 23. The Crimson Duel. The throne room of Torhallen was bathed in an ominous crimson light as Allarian stepped through its grand doors. The chamber, once a symbol of royal authority, now bore the taint of chaos. Arcane symbols pulsed along the walls, and the air buzzed with a dark energy that prickled against his skin. At the far end of the room, seated on the throne, was Halthar. The former king no longer concealed his allegiance. His form had been twisted by chaos, his once proud visage now a grotesque amalgamation of human and beast. His skin shimmered with an otherworldly sheen, and his eyes burned with the malevolent glow of Tzeentch power. Around him, cloaked cultists chanted in a guttural language, their voices a discordant harmony that seemed to reverberate in Allarian's very bones. "You've come at last, nephew," Halthar said, rising from the throne. His voice was deeper, warped, and layered with a serpentine undertone. "I wondered how long you would cling to your futile quest." Allarian drew his sword, its steel gleaming defiantly in the unnatural light. "Your schemes end here, Halthar. You've poisoned this kingdom for long enough." Halthar laughed, a sound that echoed like shattering glass. "You think you can defeat me? Tzeentch has granted me strength beyond your comprehension. This kingdom is mine, boy, and you are nothing but a new—" The battle began. Without another word, Halthar raised his hand, and a torrent of blue fire erupted from his palm. Allarian dove to the side, the flames scorching the marble where he had stood. Rolling to his feet, he lunged forward, his blade slashing toward Halthar's chest. But the corrupted king moved with unnatural speed, his claws deflecting the strike effortlessly. "Did you think this would be easy?" Halthar taunted, his voice mocking. "You're fighting more than a man now." The duel intensified, their weapons clashing in a storm of sparks and steel. Halthar's movements were fluid, almost serpentine, his chaos-fueled strength making him a nearly invincible foe. Every strike Allarian landed seemed to do little more than enrage him, the wounds knitting themselves back together almost instantly. Allarian's breaths came in ragged gasps as he struggled to match his uncle's ferocity. The room itself seemed to shift and twist, the chaos energy warping the space around them. Shadows coiled and stretched, forming grotesque shapes that lunged at Allarian, forcing him to split his focus. "You're slowing, nephew," Halthar said, his claws raking across Allarian's armor, leaving deep gouges. "Tzeentch whispers your defeat, and I hear it clearly." A desperate move. Allarian stumbled back, his mind racing. He could not win this fight through strength alone. His hand brushed against the chaos fragment in his pocket, its faint pulse matching the rhythm of his heart. The artifact was dangerous, but it was also the only chance he had. "I hear whispers too, Halthar," Allarian said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "And they tell me your time is running out." He gripped the fragment and thrust it forward, channeling its energy into his blade. The sword's steel turned a brilliant gold, its edge crackling with a power that cut through the suffocating chaos in the room. Halthar hesitated, his smirk faltering as the air around Allarian shifted. "Let's finish this," Allarian growled, surging forward with renewed strength. Their blades met again, but this time, Allarian's strikes carried the weight of the fragment's power. The golden light seared Halthar's corrupted flesh, forcing him to retreat with every blow. For a moment, it seemed as though the tide had turned. But chaos is never so easily defeated. The cultists' intervention. As Allarian pressed his advantage, the chanting of the cultists grew louder, their voices rising to a fever pitch. The symbols on the walls flared, and the room trembled as a portal began to form behind Halthar. The swirling vortex of blue and gold light was unstable, crackling with energy that threatened to consume everything around it. Halthor glanced over his shoulder and laughed. "You've delayed the inevitable, boy, but you cannot stop it. Chaos always prevails." With a final desperate strike, Allarian drove his blade toward Halthar's chest. But before it could connect, the cultist's spell reached its climax. The portal surged forward, enveloping Halthar in a blinding light. He vanished into the vortex, his laughter echoing as the portal collapsed in on itself. The room fell silent, the crimson light fading to a dull gray. The cultists were gone, their ritual complete, leaving Allarian alone in the wreckage of the throne room. He fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his grasp as exhaustion overtook him. A hollow victory. Though Halthar was gone, the victory felt empty. The corrupted king had escaped, his plans only temporarily delayed. Allarian stared at the fractured remains of the throne, his chest heaving with labored breaths. The chaos fragment in his hand pulsed faintly, its power now a burden he could not escape. He had confronted Halthar, but the cost had been high. The kingdom was still fractured, its people still in danger, and somewhere, in the dark corners of the world, Halthar was regrouping, his alliance with Tzeentch stronger than ever. Rising to his feet, Allarian sheathed his sword and turned toward the shattered doors of the throne room. The battle was far from over, but he would not give up. For his father, for Valine, for the kingdom, he would see this through to the end, even if it cost him everything. Chapter 24. The Riven Kingdom. The kingdom of Torhalin was no longer whole. Halthar's escape and the eruption of chaos energy during the confrontation had fractured not only the court, but the realm itself. The skies over the land were perpetually clouded, streaked with eerie hues of blue and gold that cast unnatural light over the devastated countryside. Villages burned, their inhabitants scattered or enslaved by roving bands of chaos cultists. The people's whispers were filled with despair. Rumors of chaos's growing influence and the kingdom's inevitable fall. Allarian stood atop the battlements of a crumbling fortress, his gaze sweeping over the war-torn land. Below him, a makeshift camp bustled with activity as loyalist soldiers and villagers prepared for the next battle. Their numbers were few, but their resolve was fierce. These were the survivors, those who had refused to bow to chaos and who still believed in the hope of a united kingdom. The emergence of chaos. Reports flooded in daily. Cultist forces had risen in strength, bolstered by monstrous entities that emerged from Tzeentch's dark rituals. These horrors, beasts with shifting forms and shimmering iridescent hides, struck terror into even the bravest soldiers. Towns and castles that had once been strongholds of the realm now flew the banners of chaos, their rulers either corrupted or slain. "Allarian, we cannot hold the line much longer," said Sir Cale, the commander of the loyalist forces, as he joined the prince on the battlements. His armor was dented and blood-stained, a testament to the battles they had fought to reclaim what little ground they could. "Our enemies are too many, and our allies are too few." Allarian turned to Cale, his expression grim but determined. "We don't need many, Cale. We need the right ones. We must rally those who remain loyal to the crown, lords, knights, anyone willing to fight for their home." Kael sighed, his brow furrowed. "Most of the nobility has either fallen to chaos or retreated to their keeps, unwilling to risk their lives. Why would they listen to us?" "They will listen," Allarian said, his voice sharp, "because if we fail there will be nothing left to rule. Chaos will consume us all." A call to arms. That night, Allarian summoned the camp's leaders to a war council. The flickering firelight illuminated the tired but resolute faces of his commanders, knights, and trusted advisors. "The kingdom is broken," Allarian began, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. "Halthar's betrayal and chaos's corruption have left us in ruins, but this is not the end." He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of each person. "The people need a leader. They need someone to unite them, to show them that we can still fight back. I will be that leader, but I cannot do it alone." "What do you propose?" asked Lady Brindis, a fierce and pragmatic knight who had joined the loyalist cause after her castle was overrun by chaos forces. "We send envoys to the remaining lords and leaders," Allarian replied. "We show them the truth of what we face and make them see that their survival depends on standing together. If they will not come willingly, we will bring their people to our cause. The nobles can hide in their keeps, but the people will not be abandoned." The room fell silent, the weight of Allarian's words sinking in. Finally, Cale nodded. "It's a risk, but it's a risk worth taking." The shadow of betrayal. As the loyalists prepared for their mission, rumors of spies and traitors within their ranks began to spread. Chaos had always thrived on deception, and the fear of betrayal threatened to unravel the fragile unity. One night, a soldier approached Allarian with a grim report. "My lord, we've captured a man claiming to be a messenger from one of the lords you seek to rally, but he carries a symbol of Tzeentch." Allarian's jaw tightened. "Bring him to me." The man was brought before Allarian, his face pale but defiant. Under questioning, he admitted to being an agent of chaos, sent to sow discord and undermine the Loyalists' efforts. "What should we do with him?" Cale asked, his hand resting on his sword. Allarian hesitated, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The man was an enemy, but his execution could further divide the camp, fueling the fear and mistrust already festering among the Loyalists. "Lock him up," Allarian said finally. "Let the others see that justice will be done, not vengeance." The first victory. Despite the challenges, the Loyalists pressed forward. Allarian led a small force to reclaim a key stronghold, a fortified village that had fallen to Chaos cultists. The battle was fierce, with the cultists unleashing their monstrous allies to defend their hold. But Allarian's leadership and the Loyalists' determination turned the tide. As the sun rose over the blood-stained battlefield, the Loyalists raised their banners high. The village was theirs, and its surviving inhabitants joined the cause, their hope rekindled by the sight of Allarian's unwavering resolve. The Riven Kingdom. As the Loyalist forces regrouped, Allarian stood before the assembled soldiers and villagers. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "The kingdom is fractured, but together we can rebuild it. Chaos seeks to divide us, to make us turn on one another. We will not give them that victory." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in defiance of the darkness that surrounded them. For the first time in weeks, Allarian felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was long and perilous, but the tide was beginning to turn. Allarian looked to the horizon, where the ruins of the kingdom stretched out before him. Chaos still held sway over much of the land, but now he had a chance to fight back, to reclaim what had been lost, to unite a Riven kingdom. And he would not stop until the last shadow of Tzeentch was banished. Chapter 25. The Price of Power. The Loyalist camp was quiet, the night heavy with an unnatural stillness that sent shivers down Allarian's spine. The battle for the fortified village had been a victory, but the cost had been great. Supplies were dwindling, morale was fragile, and Chaos forces were regrouping. Time was running out, and Allarian knew it. He sat alone in a dimly lit tent, the fragment of the Chaos tome spread open before him. Its runes glowed faintly, pulsing like a living thing. The artifact had become both a lifeline and a curse. The knowledge it contained was the key to fighting Chaos, but each time Allarian invoked its power, he felt a piece of himself slipping away. His hands trembled as he traced the symbols on the page, the words seeming to rearrange themselves under his touch. He had resisted its lure for as long as he could, but desperation had left him with no choice. The first spell. The runes described a spell to enhance strength and endurance, a gift that would allow him to lead his soldiers into battle against overwhelming odds. But the price was clear: his blood and more. Allarian retrieved his dagger, its blade glinting in the lantern light. His reflection in the blade startled him. His eyes were darker, the shadows beneath them more pronounced. He looked older, wearier. The portrait had taken much of his corruption, but not all of it. He pressed the blade to his palm, wincing as the steel bit into his flesh. Blood dripped onto the tome, and the runes flared, bathing the tent in an eerie blue light. The air grew heavy, and a voice, low and insidious, whispered in the back of his mind, "You seek power, mortal? Then take it, if you dare." The magic surged through him, a searing heat that burned from the inside out. Allarian fell to his knees, gasping as his muscles tightened, his vision sharpening. The pain faded, replaced by a rush of strength unlike anything he had ever felt. But as he rose to his feet, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the tent's polished shield. His eyes glowed faintly, their once azure hue now tinged with gold. His veins, visible beneath his skin, shimmered with a faint, unnatural light. He clenched his fists, willing the changes to subside, but they lingered, a reminder of the cost of the spell. The second spell. The next day, reports reached the camp of a Chaos Warband marching toward them. Outnumbered and outmatched, the Loyalists faced annihilation if they stayed. Allarian turned to the tome again, desperate for a way to even the odds. This time, the spell was one of illusion, a way to shroud the camp in a veil of shadow, hiding their movements from the enemy. The cost was not specified, but Allarian no longer hesitated. He followed the rune's instructions, chanting the incantation as he spilled his blood once more. The shadows around the camp came alive, twisting and stretching until they enveloped the tents and soldiers in an impenetrable darkness. The Chaos Warband passed by without noticing them, their monstrous howls fading into the distance. But as the spell faded, Allarian felt the weight of its price. His thoughts were clouded, his memories fragmented. Moments from his past, his father's smile, his childhood with Kale, felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else. The tome's whispers grew louder, urging him to use its power again. The third spell. The breaking point came during the next battle. The Chaos forces had returned, their numbers overwhelming. The Loyalists fought valiantly, but it was clear they would not hold. As soldiers fell around him, Allarian felt the fragments pull, its power thrumming against his chest like a second heartbeat. "You must stop this," Kale shouted over the din of battle, his sword flashing as he struck down an enemy. "We'll retreat and regroup, there's still a chance." "Ah!" Allarian growled, his voice harsher than he intended. "We end this now!" He tore the fragment from his cloak and raised it high. The runes flared, blindingly bright, as he chanted the spell. The ground trembled, and a surge of raw energy erupted from the artifact, tearing through the Chaos forces with devastating force. Soldiers and beasts alike were thrown back, their bodies consumed by the unnatural. When the light faded, the battlefield was silent. The Chaos forces were gone, their remnants scattered like ash on the wind. The Loyalists stared at Allarian in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. The price revealed. Allarian dropped to his knees, the fragment slipping from his grasp. His body felt heavy, his vision swimming. Kale rushed to his side, his face pale. "How can I help you?" "You?" the prosecutor said. "I've done this." Allarian tried to respond, but his voice faltered. He looked down at his hands and saw the truth. His veins pulsed with golden light, his skin marred with faint, swirling patterns like the runes in the tome. His reflection in Kale's blade confirmed what he already knew. His humanity was slipping away. "The price of power," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is what it takes." Kale grabbed his shoulder, his grip firm. "At what cost, Allarian? Look at yourself. This isn't who you are." Allarian met his friend's gaze, his resolve flickering. "It's who I must be, Kale. If I fall, the kingdom falls with me." Kale's expression darkened, but he said nothing. The prince rose unsteadily to his feet, his glowing eyes scanning the battlefield. The price of power had been steep, but the Loyalists had survived. For now, a path forward. That night, Allarian sat alone, staring at the fragment. The whispers were louder than ever, their promises seductive and insistent. He knew the next time he used the tome's power, the cost would be greater. Perhaps it would take his memories, his will, or even his soul. But as he gazed out over the camp, watching his soldiers rest and recover, he steeled himself. The price of power was high, but he would pay it, again and again, if it meant saving his kingdom. Even if, in the end, there was nothing left of him to save. Chapter 26. Portress Dominion. The nights had grown longer, the shadows in Allarian's tent deeper, almost alive. The camp bustled with preparations for the next battle, but the prince remained isolated, his mind consumed by the weight of the tome's power and the fragment that pulsed faintly at his side. Above all, it was the portrait that haunted him. Though the painting had been destroyed, its presence lingered in Allarian's mind like a splinter that could not be removed. It was not the grotesque figure he once feared, but something worse, a constant whisper in the recesses of his thoughts. It no longer needed a frame or canvas. It lived within him now. The whispers began. Late one night, as Allarian sat by the dying embers of his fire, the whispers returned, insistent and clear. "You are delaying the inevitable, Prince," the voice said, smooth and coaxing. "You've tasted my power. Why fight what you already know to be true?" Allarian froze, his hand gripping the chaos fragment reflexively. "You are nothing but a shadow," he muttered. "A lie conjured by chaos." "A lie," the voice replied, amused. "I am the only truth you have left. The kingdom despises you. Your loyalists fear you. Even your closest allies question your choices. Only I see you for who you truly are." Allarian's grip tightened, his knuckles white. "You see nothing." "I see everything," the voice hissed. "Your doubts, your pain, your desire. You crave the power I offer, yet you resist, clinging to a shattered ideal of who you once were. Let it go, Allarian. Embrace what you have become." Visions of temptation. The whispers grew louder, and Allarian's surroundings began to shift. The flickering light of the fire dimmed, and the air grew heavy with an unnatural chill. He was no longer in his tent, but in a vast, dark expanse. Before him, the portrait reappeared, whole and vivid, its surface rippling as though alive. The figure in the painting had changed again. It was no longer monstrous, but an idealized version of Allarian himself. This figure stood tall and proud, its armor gleaming, its expression serene, yet commanding. Behind it, the kingdom stretched out in perfect harmony, its people bowing in reverence. "This is what I offer," the portrait said, its voice rich and inviting. "A kingdom united under your rule. A people who worship you not out of fear but devotion. Power enough to end the chaos that threatens to consume all." Allarian took a step back, his chest tight. "At what cost?" The portrait's smile widened. "Does it matter? You've already begun to pay. The fragment, the tome, the spells, they have paved the way. You only need to take the final step." The vision shifted, and Allarian saw himself standing before a crowd of nobles and soldiers, his glowing eyes commanding their loyalty. At his feet lay the broken forms of his enemies, chaos cultists, traitorous lords, and even the monstrous form of Halthar. The people chanted his name, their voices echoing like a hymn. "This is your destiny," the portrait whispered. "Do not deny it." The struggle within. Allarian tore his gaze from the vision, his hands trembling. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is not who I am." "Not yet," the portrait replied. "But you will be. Every spell you cast, every drop of blood you spill brings you closer to me. You know it, I know it. Why fight?" "I fight because I must," Allarian snarled, his voice rising. "For my father, for the kingdom, for myself." The portrait's serene expression twisted into a mocking sneer. "And yet you've sacrificed all of those things to reach this point. Your father's memory is a tool, your kingdom a crumbling ruin, and yourself, well, we both know there's little of you left." The words struck deep, and Allarian staggered, his resolve faltering. The portrait stepped out of the frame, its movements fluid and deliberate. It stood before him now, a mirror image of the man he once was. "You cannot win this war without me," the doppelganger said. "Tzeentch forces are too strong, Haltar too cunning. Only my power can give you what you need." The breaking point. Allarian fell to his knees, his head in his hands. The whispers, the visions, the power, they had become too much. He could feel himself slipping, his identity fracturing under the weight of the choices he had made. "Leave me," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I will not become you." The doppelganger knelt before him, its voice soft yet insistent. "You already are me, Allarian. Every time you use the fragment, every time you open the tome, you become more. Stop fighting, and let me help you." Allarian looked up, his glowing eyes meeting those of his reflection. For a moment he wavered, the temptation almost overwhelming. The vision of a united kingdom, a decisive victory over chaos, was within his grasp. But then he thought of Valine's sacrifice, of Kael's unwavering loyalty, of the soldiers who had placed their lives in his hands. They had not fought for power or dominion, they had fought for hope. "No," he said firmly, rising to his feet. "I will not surrender to you. I will find another way." The portrait's serene expression twisted into a snarl of rage. "Then you will fail. You will lose everything." "Perhaps," Allarian said, his voice steady. "But I will not lose myself." The portrait's warning. The vision shattered, and Allarian found himself back in his tent, the fragment still glowing faintly in his hand. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence, but he knew the portrait's presence lingered, its influence waiting to resurface. He stared at the fragment for a long moment before tucking it away, his resolve hardening. The price of power had grown too steep, and he could no longer afford to pay it. He would fight chaos on his own terms, even if it meant facing his darkest fears without the crutch of forbidden magic. As he stepped out of the tent, the cold night air filled his lungs, and the distant sound of soldiers preparing for battle reached his ears. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in days, Allarian felt a flicker of hope. The portrait's dominion had not yet claimed him, and as long as he drew breath, he would resist it. Chapter 27. The Betrayal. The night was unusually quiet, the Loyalist camp wrapped in an eerie stillness that set Allarian on edge. He stood near the fire at the center of the camp, his mind a tempest of doubts and fears. Sir Kael approached from the shadows, his armor faintly glinting in the firelight. "Allarian," Kael said, his voice measured but tense. "We need to talk." Allarian turned to his oldest friend, sensing the weight behind his words. "What is it, Kael? Another report? News of chaos movements?" "No," Kael said sharply. "This is about you." A confrontation. Kael gestured toward Allarian's tent, his tone grave. "Let's speak privately." Inside the tent, the dim glow of a lantern cast long shadows across the walls. Allarian folded his arms, his expression guarded. "Say what you need to, Kael." Kael's jaw tightened, and he hesitated before speaking. "I've known you my entire life, Allarian. I've followed you into battle, trusted you when others doubted, but now I need to know the truth." His voice dropped to a whisper. "What is happening to you?" Allarian stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me," Kael snapped, his frustration breaking through. "I've seen the way you've changed. Your eyes, they glow with that unnatural light. Your strength, your endurance. No man possesses such power without a price." Allarian's heart sank. He had worked hard to conceal the toll the chaos fragment and the tome had taken on him, but Kael's keen eyes had seen through the facade. "It's complicated," Allarian said, his voice low. "I've done what I had to. For the kingdom. For all of us." Kael stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "And what about the portrait?" Allarian froze, the blood draining from his face. "I found it, or what's left of it," Kael said, his tone bitter. "I've seen the remnants, the fragments of a canvas that reeks of chaos. That thing. It wasn't just a painting, was it?" The truth revealed. Allarian sat heavily on the edge of his cot, his head in his hands. "The portrait. It was more than a painting. It was a vessel, a curse. It took my corruption, my sins, and bore their weight so I could remain strong." Kael's face twisted in disbelief. "You let it take your sins? Do you hear yourself? You've tied yourself to chaos, Allarian. How could you let it come to this?" "Had no choice," Allarian shot back, his voice raw with anger and desperation. "The kingdom was falling apart. I needed the power to fight back, to save what was left." "And what has it cost you?" Kael demanded. "Look at yourself, Allarian. You've become something else. Do you even recognize who you are anymore?" Kael's decision. Kael paced the tent, his expression stormy. Finally, he stopped and turned to Allarian, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "The portrait? It must be destroyed. It's the only way to free you from its influence." "No," Allarian said quickly, rising to his feet. "You don't understand. If the portrait is destroyed, everything it's taken from me will return. All the corruption, the darkness, it will consume me." Kael's eyes narrowed. "And what happens if we leave it intact? Do you think you can control this forever? This isn't just about you, Allarian. It's about the kingdom." "Kael, please," Allarian said, his voice softening. "You're my only ally. Don't do this." Kael's expression hardened. "I'm sorry, Allarian, but I can't stand by and watch you destroy yourself, and us, with this." Before Allarian could stop him, Kael turned and stormed out of the tent. The portrait's destruction. Allarian's heart pounded as he raced after Kael, but by the time he reached his private quarters, it was too late. Kael stood before the shattered remnants of the portrait, his sword dripping with ichor-like paint. The air was thick with the acrid smell of chaos, and the shards of the canvas glowed faintly as they disintegrated. Kael turned to Allarian, his face stricken but resolute. "It's done." A sudden, violent wave of energy erupted from the remains of the portrait, knocking both men to the ground. Allarian screamed as a searing pain coursed through his body. The corruption the portrait had absorbed surged back into him like a flood, its weight overwhelming. His veins pulsed with molten heat, his skin burning as dark patterns spread across his flesh, his vision blurred, the world spinning as the voice of the portrait returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "You're mine now." The aftermath. When the pain subsided, Allarian lay on the floor, trembling and gasping for breath. His body was changed, his eyes now fully golden, his skin marked with swirling runes that pulsed faintly. He could feel the darkness within him, clawing at the edges of his mind, whispering promises of power and destruction. Kael knelt beside him, his expression filled with regret. "Allarian, I thought this would free you." Allarian laughed bitterly, his voice hoarse. "You've freed nothing, Kael. All you've done is unleash what I tried to contain." The two men sat in silence, the weight of their actions hanging heavily in the air. The kingdom was still in peril, chaos still loomed, and now Allarian bore the full burden of his sins. But even in his despair, a spark of resolve remained. He would not let chaos win. Not yet. "I can still fight this," Allarian said, his voice steady despite the darkness surging within him. "But I'll need you, Kael. Now more than ever." Kael nodded, his expression grim. "You'll have me, Allarian. until the end. Chapter 28. The Final Confrontation. The storm above the ruined palace of Tor-Halen raged with unnatural fury, the sky churning with blue and gold light that painted the crumbling spires in an eerie glow. Allarian ascended the shattered stairway leading to the throne room's exposed rooftop, each step heavier than the last. His body, marked with glowing runes and corrupted by chaos, ached with every movement. His mind, fractured and teetering on the edge, was a battleground of whispers and resolve. At the peak, amidst the howling winds, stood Halthar. The once proud king had fully embraced chaos, his form a monstrous amalgamation of flesh and shadow. His armor was jagged and organic, its surface writhing with living tendrils. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and his voice, when it came, was layered with a deep, otherworldly resonance. "Look broken, nephew," Halthar said, his tone mocking. "As you should. You've carried the burden of power poorly. But I suppose I should thank you. Your efforts have only strengthened me." Allarian raised his sword, its blade still glowing faintly from the fragment's lingering power. "This ends here, Halthar. No more lies, no more chaos. Just you and me." Halthar laughed, the sound reverberating through the ruined palace. "You think you can end this with brute force? You're already mine, Allarian. Look at yourself. Marked, corrupted, consumed. You're no different from me." "I am different," Allarian snarled, stepping forward. "Because I still have something to fight for." The battle begins. Halthor struck first, his clawed hand slashing through the air and unleashing a wave of searing blue flame. Allarian rolled to the side, the heat licking at his armor as he closed the distance between them. Their blades clashed with a deafening ring, sparks flying as chaos energy crackled between them. Halthar's strength was immense, each strike forcing Allarian back, but the prince fought with a desperate ferocity, his corrupted body granting him the endurance to withstand the onslaught. The rooftop became a maelstrom of violence, the storm above mirroring the battle below. "You've always been too weak, Allarian," Halthar taunted, his blade carving through the air in a brutal arc. "Too afraid to embrace what you could be." "I've seen what you've become," Allarian retorted, blocking the strike and countering with a thrust that scraped against Halthar's corrupted armor. "And I'll die before I let this kingdom fall to chaos." A struggle of wills. As the battle raged, Halthar's powers grew more erratic, the influence of Tzeentch warping the space around them. The ruined stones of the rooftop floated into the air, twisting and shifting as though caught in a dream. Allarian's footing faltered, and Halthar seized the opportunity, driving him to the ground with a crushing blow. Pinned beneath his uncle's blade, Allarian gritted his teeth as Halthar leaned closer, his monstrous face contorted in a cruel grin. "You're already lost, nephew. Let me finish this. Give in, and I'll make your end swift." Allarian's gaze flicked to the fragment hanging from his belt, its glow faint but steady. He could feel its power, its pull, urging him to unleash it one final time. But he hesitated, the whispers in his mind growing louder. "Use it," they urged. "Wield the power. Become what you must to win." "No," Allarian muttered, his voice trembling but firm. "I will not fall." With a surge of strength, he twisted beneath Halthar, breaking free and driving his blade upward. The strike caught Halthar across the chest, sending him staggering back with a roar of pain. The turning point. Allarian rose to his feet, his breaths ragged. His body felt as though it were tearing itself apart, the corruption within him threatening to overwhelm his will. But he pressed on, his sword steady as he advanced on Halthar. "You've sacrificed everything for power," Allarian said, his voice echoing over the storm. "Your brother, your kingdom, your soul. And for what? To serve a master that will discard you the moment you're no longer useful?" "Tzeentch does not discard," Halthar snarled, his voice filled with desperation. "He rewards visionaries, those who see the truth of the world. And you're nothing but a pawn," Allarian interrupted, his voice rising. "And I will end your game." Halthar lunged, but Allarian sidestepped, his blade flashing in a deadly arc that severed Halthar's clawed arm. The corrupted king howled, his form flickering as chaos energy spilled from the wound. The final blow. As Halthar staggered, Allarian raised his sword, the fragment's power flaring one last time. The blade gleamed with a golden light that cut through the storm, illuminating the rooftop with an otherworldly radiance. "For my father," Allarian said, his voice steady. He drove the blade into Halthar's chest, the impact unleashing a surge of energy that sent shockwaves through the ruined palace. Halthar's monstrous form convulsed, his screams of rage and pain echoing into the night. The chaos energy within him erupted, consuming his body in a torrent of blue and gold flames. When the light faded, Halthar was gone. The aftermath. Allarian fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his grasp. The storm above began to dissipate, the unnatural colors fading to reveal a clear night sky. The palace, though ruined, was silent once more. But the victory was hollow. Allarian's body was ravaged, his glowing eyes dim but still marked by the corruption he had borne for so long. He stared at his trembling hands, the swirling runes on his skin faint but permanent. Kale and the loyalist soldiers arrived moments later, their faces a mix of relief and horror. Kale knelt beside Allarian, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's over." Allarian nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "For now." The blood feud was ended, but the cost had been immense. Allarian had won the battle, but the scars, both physical and spiritual, would remain. He had fought chaos and emerged victorious, but he knew the fight for the kingdom's soul was far from over. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace, staring at the stars as the storm within him raged on. Chapter 29. The Mask Falls. The ruins of Torhalen stood silent under the dawning light. The storm had passed, and the unnatural hues of blue and gold that once tainted the skies had faded to a pale gray. The loyalist forces, battered and weary, began to pick their way through the rubble, their victory over Halthar hollow and tinged with despair. Allarian stood alone atop the shattered palace, staring out at the kingdom he had fought so hard to save. The corruption that had coursed through his veins during the battle was now a roiling storm within him, growing stronger with every passing moment. His glowing eyes reflected the rising sun, but the light within them was not one of hope. It was the searing, destructive power of chaos. Kale climbed the ruined staircase to join him, his armor dented and blood-stained. "Allarian," he called, his voice filled with both relief and fear. "It's over. Halthar is gone. The kingdom can be rebuilt." Allarian turned to face him, his expression distant, almost serene, but the golden runes that traced his skin pulsed faintly, a reminder of the power that now consumed him. "No, Kale," Allarian said softly. "It's not over. It was never over." The rising chaos. Kale frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean? We've won. The people will rally. We can rebuild." Allarian shook his head. "Look around you, Kale. The kingdom lies in ruins. The people are broken, scattered. And me, I am not the man who can lead them." "You're wrong," Kale insisted, his voice firm. "You're still their prince. You're still my friend." Allarian's gaze dropped to his hands, the glowing runes now spreading like cracks across his skin. "Am I? Or am I something else entirely?" The air around them grew heavy, and the faint sound of whispers began to creep into the edges of Kale's hearing. He stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. "Allarian, what's happening?" The prince looked up, his eyes meeting Kale's. "The mask falls," he said simply. "And the truth is revealed." The transformation. Allarian's body convulsed, the runes blazing with golden light as chaos energy surged through him. He fell to his knees, gasping as the power within him erupted outward. Chaol rushed to his side, reaching out, but a wave of energy pushed him back, sending him sprawling across the rubble. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a cacophony of malice and seduction. Around Allarian, the air shimmered, rippling like a mirage. His form began to shift, his armor cracking and falling away as his body twisted under the weight of the energy. "Allarian," Chaol shouted, struggling to his feet. "Fight it! You're stronger than this." "I tried," Allarian said, his voice strained and hollow, "but the price of power is too steep." The light around him intensified, blinding and unbearable. The stones beneath his feet cracked and crumbled, and the very air seemed to hum with the force of his transformation. His voice grew distant, layered with an otherworldly resonance. "I thought I could save them. I thought I could save myself." The vanishing. Chaol shielded his eyes as the light reached its peak. When it faded, Allarian was no longer there. In his place, a swirling vortex of golden and blue light hung in the air, crackling with raw energy. The whispers echoed louder now, filling the ruins with an eerie, unrelenting sound. The vortex began to collapse inward, folding in on itself until it was no more. The air grew still, the whispers fading into silence. Allarian was gone, consumed by the chaos energy he had sought to banish. Chaol fell to his knees, staring at the empty space where his friend had stood. The ruins around him seemed to groan, as though mourning the loss. In the distance, the soldiers and villagers who had gathered to rebuild stared up at the palace, their faces etched with confusion and fear. The collapse. Without Allarian's leadership, the fragile unity of the Loyalists began to fracture. Fear of chaos, of betrayal, and of the unknown seeped into their ranks. Arguments erupted, alliances crumbled, and the kingdom that Allarian had fought to save teetered on the brink of complete collapse. Chaol, burdened by grief and guilt, took up what remained of the Loyalist forces, but his efforts to hold the kingdom together were met with resistance at every turn. The shadow of chaos lingered, its influence still present in the hearts of men. And yet, even as the kingdom fell into ruin, whispers of Allarian's name spread. To some, he became a martyr, a prince who sacrificed everything to save his people. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a man consumed by the power he sought to wield. The legacy of the fallen prince. In the years that followed, the ruins of Tor Hylen became a place of legend. Travelers spoke of the swirling vortex that had claimed the last prince, and of the golden light that still lingered in the stones. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind, faint and distant, as though Allarian's voice still echoed through the aether. And in the darkest corners of the realm, cultists whispered of a figure who walked the shadows, a being neither man nor demon, but something in between. They called him the Riven Prince, a herald of chaos who bore the scars of a kingdom's fall. But for those who knew him, for those who had fought beside him, Allarian's memory was simpler. He was a man who had tried to save his people, who had faced the darkness with everything he had, and who had paid the ultimate price. The mask had fallen. The kingdom was lost. But Allarian's story would live on. Chapter 30. A Legacy of Shadows. The kingdom of Tor Hylen was no more. Its lands were splintered, its castles overgrown with vines, and its people scattered across the realm. Yet amidst the ruin, the tale of Prince Allarian persisted, whispered in quiet corners, recounted in song and story, and etched into the memories of those who had survived. In a small village nestled at the edge of what was once the kingdom's eastern border, an elderly storyteller gathered the children around the fire. His voice carried the weight of years and the solemnity of experience as he began his tale. Long ago there was a prince, he said, his eyes distant as he stared into the flames. A man of courage and conviction, who sought to save his people from a darkness that threatened to consume them all. His name was Allarian, and his story is one of heroism, tragedy, and sacrifice. A tale retold. The storyteller wove the events of Allarian's life into a vivid narrative. His return to Tor Halen, the discovery of his father's murder, and the battle against his treacherous uncle Helthar. He spoke of the cursed portrait that bore Allarian's sins, the battles waged against chaos, and the desperate measures the prince took to protect his people. Power came at a price, the old man continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. And Prince Allarian paid it willingly, though it cost him his humanity. He became a figure of light and shadow, a savior and a warning. The children sat wide-eyed, their imaginations alight with the images of monstrous cultists, swirling storms of chaos, and the prince who stood against it all. One of them, a boy with a mop of unruly hair, leaned forward. "What happened to him, grandfather? Did he win?" The storyteller paused, his expression thoughtful. "He won, but at great cost. Allarian defeated his uncle, but the power he wielded was too much. He was consumed by it, vanishing into the Aether, leaving behind a kingdom in ruins." The survivor's perspective. Elsewhere, those who had fought alongside Allarian carried their own versions of his story. Soldiers who had followed him spoke of his unwavering resolve, his ability to inspire even in the darkest moment. He was a man of contradictions, Cale would later tell a group of gathered loyalists. His once proud armor now hung tarnished on his shoulders, his face lined with years of hardship. He carried the burden of his sins, but he never stopped fighting for us. He was flawed, yes, but who among us isn't? Others, like Lady Brindis, recounted the battles with a mixture of awe and sorrow. Allarian stood against chaos when no one else would. He bore its weight so we didn't have to, but the cost was greater than anyone could have imagined. The legend grows. In time, Allarian's tale became legend. To some, he was a tragic hero who sacrificed himself to save his people. To others, he was a cautionary figure, a man who succumbed to the very darkness he sought to destroy. The ruins of Tor Halen became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought to understand the balance between light and shadow, hope and despair. Songs were sung of the Riven prince, whose golden eyes burned with the fire of a soul torn between justice and corruption. Poems spoke of the final confrontation atop the shattered palace, where Allarian faced his uncle and the storm of chaos itself. Stories passed down through generations speculated on his fate, whether he had been lost forever to the Aether, or if he might one day return. A warning and a legacy. Though the kingdom of Tor Halen had fallen, its people carried Allarian's memory with them, spreading his story across the realm. His life became a reminder of the dangers of ambition, the cost of power, and the strength it took to resist the seductive call of darkness. The storyteller finished his tale, his voice soft as the flames died down. And so, children, the legacy of Prince Allarian lives on, not in the stones of a ruined palace or the banners of a forgotten kingdom, but in the choices we make, in the strength we find to face our fears, in the resolve to stand against the shadows, even when all seems lost. The children sat in silence, their young minds absorbing the weight of the tale. The boy with the unruly hair finally spoke, his voice filled with wonder. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" The storyteller smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the flickering embers. "Perhaps. Or perhaps his spirit lives on in all of us, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a light worth fighting for." As the fire's last ember faded into the night, the story of Prince Allarian continued, carried forward by the survivors of a fallen kingdom, a legacy of shadows but also of hope.